Chonsuk just couldn't figure out why so much crap was happening to him. His clinic was drowning in debt, and now patients were accusing him of messing up their health? Standing drunk at the edge of a bridge, he was pissed at the world, blaming himself for not being able to cure anyone while COVID was tearing everything apart. That last bottle of wine was a mistake, and now the guy was falling, heading straight for the river below. His body sank to the bottom, his mind fading out. But he had no idea this was actually the start of a whole new life. He came to, thinking someone must have saved him, not even noticing how weird the room around him looked. Suddenly, some stranger dropped to his knees by the bed, a foreign guy bawling his eyes out like he'd just buried someone. But Chonseok didn't recognize him, so the man swore he'd take care of his master even if he didn't remember him, because he was Pierrot, the royal family's personal doctor. Chonseok's head was spinning like crazy, so the doctor rushed to get him some water right away. Everything around him looked insanely expensive. Even the water pitcher had real diamonds on it. But when Chonseok caught his reflection in the mirror, he froze. He had blue eyes, blonde hair, and he wasn't even Korean, even though his family had lived there for 100 generations. The doctor started wiping sweat off his face, but Chonseok was freaking out. This wasn't his body or even his bedroom. He remembered that right before falling off the bridge, he'd been reading a fantasy novel about the Lord of the Demon Sword, a prince with a cursed fate. And if the mirror was telling the truth, his soul had landed in a made-up world, inside one of the characters. He had to check if he was right, so he started begging Pierrot to help him get his memory back. Chonseok figured he must be in a coma and this was all some messed-up dream, so he told the doctor to smack him awake. But the guy was a loyal servant, not an executioner, so Chonseok started slapping himself instead. To his shock, the slaps actually hurt. A lot. If this was just a dream, he wouldn't feel a thing. Then it hit him. This was his new life. He was now Crown Prince Rafael Magentano, which meant all those old problems, debts, sleepless nights, couldn't touch him anymore. Now he was the son of one of the richest families around, able to blow cash on whatever he wanted. But Rafael didn't get to jump on the bed for long. His head started spinning again, and he collapsed onto the pillows. Pierrot rushed over with a bunch of tonics, still totally clueless about what was happening to the prince. Sweat covered his whole body. His hands were shaking like crazy. His body was basically shutting down. Rafael Magentano was just a side character, and barely even mentioned, since the prince spent his whole life stuck in bed and died at 22. So when the doctor told him he was 21 right now, all that carefree excitement just vanished. Turns out, this so-called second chance in a new world was just an illusion. Didn't matter if he was Chonseok or Rafael, he only had a year left to live. The guy was hoping to forget his rough life, all the debt and drinking, and finally live it up like those rich kids he'd always heard about. If he's a prince, his family's got to have all kinds of medicine, and he'd need Pierrot's help to get it. According to the story, they stopped treating the prince and just handed him over to a priest, but since he actually knows medicine, he could save himself. Rafael ordered the doctor to find him the thinnest acupuncture needles he could, and fast. The Magentano mansion was huge, but all evening, not a single person visited the young master except the doctor. Rafael tried to figure out what was wrong with his body, using traditional ways to find pain points. After checking his own pulse, he realized he had a whole list of issues, from heart arrhythmia to nerve paralysis. With problems like that, dying would be easier, but since Pierrot found the right tools, he'd at least try to fix something. He laid out all the needles on the bed, trying to pick the right one. Looked like the doctor even rated the seamstresses for his request. Pierrot had no idea what any of this was for, so Rafael would have to teach him acupuncture himself. Suddenly, the man dropped to his knees, begging his master not to mess up an already broken body. This wasn't the time for drama. The prince ordered him to help, lying that he'd had a vision about the illness. Even though Rafael wasn't sure it'd work, he asked the doctor to trust him. They had a whole year to look for a cure. He showed the man the needle he'd picked, giving him a moment to decide whose side he was really on. Pierrot had known his master since the day he was born, and his whole life had been about treating him. So after bowing to the prince, he swore he'd stay loyal. Even with this, Rafael lay down on the bed. The first needle was supposed to help him breathe freely again, which is kinda important for, staying alive. He focused on the energy flowing inside his body and felt a muscle pull right under his collarbone. That was the spot he needed. As soon as he stuck the needle in, a sharp pain shot through his whole arm and settled in his lungs. His breathing sped up, his head spun from all the oxygen, and suddenly, a health status hologram popped up right in front of his eyes. He was stunned. It actually showed info about his current health and the latest changes in his body. Piero had no idea what to do. He'd promised not to interfere, but it really seemed like his master had lost his mind. From the outside, the prince looked like he was searching for something in thin air, making all these over-the-top happy noises. The doctor figured the illness must have spread to the prince's brain, and now there was just no saving him. The prince picked up another needle, ready to keep going and figure out how this hologram thing worked. He kept going, moving on to his arm, when suddenly a notification popped up saying his breathing spasms had gone down. Piero just couldn't take the madness anymore. He dropped to his knees and started begging God to give the prince some peace. Well, the novel wasn't kidding about how religious people were here, but right now Raphael just needed to heal himself. Thanks to his medical training, he knew he had to wake up all the nerves in his right arm to get his blood pressure back to normal. The hologram said his lungs were relaxed, and the acupuncture was working on them like a massage. When he stuck in the last needle, he suddenly saw a vision. His lungs had turned into twins. Then the twins started tap dancing, and the health system told him his breathing was back to normal. But reviving one organ woke up his stomach too, and it was ready to get to work. The vision kept going, and now his stomach turned into a party guy who showed up just in time for the body's resurrection bash. The party guy started playing music for the twins, and for now, only 2 organs were healthy enough to join the celebration. But suddenly, his body healing itself triggered his family's powers. After all, Raphael lived in a fantasy world, but it wasn't fire or ice magic like you'd expect. He opened up his list of abilities and felt pretty annoyed. Seriously? Finding medicinal herbs doesn't exactly scream magical superpower. The prince figured he had to act like the old Cheonseok and diagnose himself right if he wanted to live longer. Raphael started with the first ability, remotely checking the pulse of any living thing. As soon as he activated it, he slipped into a light trance, letting a hologram scan his body. When the program spat out the results, saying the prince's body was hopeless and weaker than a frog's, he got pissed. The rush of emotion made his head spin again, and he collapsed back onto the pillows. When he came to, he went right back to moving the needles around his body, trying to cure more illnesses. But his body couldn't handle it. The prince started coughing up blood. He'd just pushed himself way too far. The cheerful dancers in his vision vanished, replaced by chaos and a wrecked stage, and his organs started failing again. Raphael's body was seriously weak. According to the program, if he kept up the acupuncture, he'd only buy himself another month. Back in his old life, Cheonseok used to give his patients all kinds of tonics, so now Raphael needed to find something similar in this new world. Piero was surprised. His master had never cared about medicine before, but suddenly, he seemed to know a ton about it. Raphael was tired of having to convince the doctor to help every time. If the guy swore to help, why did he keep trying to stop him? Still, Raphael tried to be polite and asked him to bring all the strongest herbs they had in storage. Right now, he had to convince the man to bring him some aconite root, which was pretty unusual for treatment. The doctor admitted that after the prince got kicked out of the main palace, their medical budget got slashed, but he'd try to find the root anyway. Piero really tried to stay out of his master's business, but Raphael insisted he needed to eat that plant. Now the man was terrified. He was sure some demon had possessed his master and wanted to kill him. The doctor dropped to his knees in front of the prince again, refusing to take part in poisoning his master with aconite. He'd spent years looking after the poor family's son, but I guess it wasn't enough, since the prince is desperate enough to risk everything. Raphael just put it simply. He wouldn't eat the whole root, just the fresh part. But Piero wasn't some clueless doctor. He knew full well this stuff could stop your heart. Even though the prince promised to share the secret of how to control the poison, Piero didn't buy it. Sure, nobody in this world knows anything about detox yet, but if you get the dose right, nobody has to die. There was no other choice. Piero agreed to help. He knew the usual treatments hadn't worked for ages, and honestly, the whole family had already mourned the prince. In the darkness of the empty hallways, the doctor snuck into the mansion's storage room, relieved the servants were asleep and the prince's experiments would go unseen. After the move, their medical supplies were running low, but after checking every shelf, Piero found a few roots. The prince was getting weaker, and Piero decided that even if it cost him his life to test this detox method, he wouldn't regret it. Raphael was pumped when he managed to brew up an elixir from the poisonous roots in record time. But the doctor wasn't impressed by the prince's excitement, and tried once again to talk him out of it. So when the young master jokingly offered Piero the first sip, Piero agreed right away. In the novel, Piero was the most loyal servant, starting out as the family doctor's assistant. Over time, every doctor in the kingdom refused to treat Raphael, so Piero took responsibility for the heir's life. But as the story went on, when Raphael Magentano died, His doctor was executed for the prince's murder. Sure, the doctor's a good man, but the new Raphael isn't about to share his modern medical knowledge with him. Time to take the potion, so the guy poured himself a small test dose. He had to distract the doctor somehow, so the prince started lying, saying the elixir needed to steep and cool first. Piero was starting to catch on that the master was hiding something, and he wasn't in a hurry to leave the kitchen. And if he finds out Raphael's a different person, things could get ugly. So the guy played the fool and started making up stories about his visions. The guy clearly didn't buy this nonsense, but while he was distracted, Raphael got his chance. The prince suddenly grabbed the cup of brew and downed the poisonous potion in one gulp. The doctor was terrified, but there was nothing he could do against his lord's stupidity. For a split second, Raphael thought everything was fine. Then his heart suddenly cramped up. A hologram popped up, telling him the elixir worked. His body was burning with inflammation, and he'd just unlocked the Rahan energy source, something only emperors were supposed to have. As a prince, Rafael Magentano learned the technique as a kid, but his weak body never let him use it. Now his heart started flooding with energy, opening up a new mana source, and his pulse shot up. A wave of power rushed through him, firing up his whole nervous system. Rafael checked his stats. His lifespan just got extended by a few more weeks. But suddenly, a sharp pain exploded in his chest, like his heart was having a heart attack. Piero was horrified. A minute ago, the prince was glowing with happiness. Now his face was pale and he was screaming in pain. The prince frantically checked his stats, and the system said his mana circle was too small for his heart. Apparently, this happened because he'd never trained his ability since childhood. His body started healing, but now his heart was trapped inside a ring of mana. If that's the case, Raphael had to calm down and try to expand the circle right now. He couldn't shrink his heart, so he focused all the energy in his body into one spot. Using his inner strength, he found the start of the circle and forced it wider through sheer willpower. But his body fought back. If Raphael didn't figure this out in the next few seconds, he'd die again, and this time, there'd be no third chance. Back in the day, when he found out his clinic was going bankrupt from patient complaints, he got seriously sick. All the debts, failures, and disappointments pushed him to save himself now. He deserved a better future, so he used every last bit of strength to stretch that mana circle. And just like that, his range of abilities exploded tenfold, and his heart finally started beating free. Piero tried to bring his master back to his senses after he collapsed on the kitchen floor. Raphael did it. He managed to snatch his life back from a deadly illness, but he wasn't sure that was the end of it. After some extreme therapy, Raphael's body was celebrating again, because the real life of the party had finally shown up. The guy's strong, powerful heart was back in action, ready to fire up the rest of his organs. His lungs and stomach were thrilled to see their boss return. They'd been waiting ages for the whole crew to get back together. Raphael checked the stats on his hologram. His body might still be weak, but now he'd live way longer. Suddenly, the system announced that, thanks to his mana ability kicking in, he could now start storing it up. A prince can't slow down progress. He jumped up off the floor and headed straight for his bedroom. Piero was still freaking out, but his charge was beaming with happiness and totally lied, saying he just tripped instead of passing out. The man felt guilty for letting the heir risk his life, instead of insisting he'd taste the potion first. Raphael ordered the doctor to clear away the leftover elixir and leave it alone. He wanted to rest. But when the prince thanked Piero for his help, the doctor was stunned. He'd never heard kind words from him before. Right now, though, none of that mattered. The prince had unlocked a mana storage slot and he needed to level it up. Once he got to his room, the guy started meditating and checking out his new abilities. Turned out, anything his body took in could be converted into energy and used to fill up his mana. Looking around the room, he only found a water jug and figured it'd do for an experiment. Remembering the basics, Raphael calculated he'd need 5 liters of water for his weakened body. Otherwise, he'd pass out. Lifting the jug, he was shocked. His body was so weak he could barely hold it. But there was no backing down. Gathering all his strength, the prince started chugging the water he found in his room. Turns out, that only gave him a single point of mana, and his body was still craving more. So, the guy chugged every pitcher he could find in the nearby rooms, and now he felt awful. Even though his ability bar was finally full. At this rate, Raphael's going to turn into a camel. He needs to find some other way to get energy. But now his slot was maxed out, and he couldn't get rid of the extra energy, so he started freaking out, worried he might actually explode. The prince glanced at the empty decanters, his head spinning, when suddenly he came up with a plan. According to the novel's plot, Rahan energy could absorb and release mana, so the guy needed to figure out how to use that. Raphael's heart clenched again from the energy surge as he tried to redirect the mana. And out of nowhere, a magic orb formed in his hand, growing bigger by the second. But his body still wasn't getting rid of the mana, so the prince tried to move it into a pitcher, but he lost control and shattered the thing. He thought it wouldn't be a big deal, but the sound of breaking glass brought every guard on the second floor running. Raphael panicked. He still wasn't used to the guards being part of the imperial family, and he had to throw them off so nobody would figure out he'd swapped souls. So he played dumb and started rambling about smashing dishes because he was mad. But it was obvious neither Pierrot nor the guard captain bought his story. Still, the captain suddenly apologized for the disturbance and promised they wouldn't bust down his doors anymore. Then he told the guards to clean up the mess and ordered the doctor to take the prince to a guest room and patch up his cuts. As Pierrot carried the heir down the hall, the guy couldn't believe everyone in the mansion was just ignoring his lies. The next bedroom was smaller, but the doctor asked the prince to deal with it for the night until his room could be cleaned up. Left alone, he started thinking about what happened. He really needed to learn how to control these mana surges. If the doctor kept watching him, Raphael wouldn't be able to hide his plans for long, so he needed to find a place to train. News always reached the emperor's main palace fast, and even in a storm, a messenger showed up with the latest update. The servant told Emperor Taros that his oldest son had started using some weird treatments, and the family doctor was actually encouraging it. The man was furious. His weak, cowardly son seemed to have finally lost his mind. For a few days, Raphael kept working on making his toxic elixir even better for boosting his body. And when the potion was ready, the guy hoped to sneak away from the doctor and chug a whole pot to level up his mana. So the prince started complaining that he needed some alone time to clear his head. But Pierrot totally knew his charge was about to risk his life again. The prince admitted he'd take a smaller dose today, just to see how his body would react. And it worked. The doctor cheered up, thinking he'd finally managed to calm the heir's enthusiasm. Time was running out, so Raphael literally kicked the doctor out into the hallway and locked himself in the kitchen. He had just a few minutes to drink the brew before Pierrot came back with the guards to break down the door. After finishing the drink, the guy was relieved he didn't pass out right away, but all those herbs seriously fired up his body. So he spent the whole sleepless night wandering the halls, trying to burn through his mana slot. After a couple hours of sleep, Raphael found that his healthy organs actually liked the brew, and according to the charts, his condition had improved. For the next few days, the guy kept taking the elixir non-stop, until his organs had no idea what was going on. Maybe his stomach was happy with the same food every day, but King Heart started losing muscle because he wasn't getting enough nutrients. When he woke up in the morning, the prince felt completely sick, and every system alert said his organs were inflamed again. By evening, the heir decided to switch to a real dinner, even though his health points didn't go up. After checking all the charts, he realized he hadn't managed to boost his mana, but his lifespan had gone up by another month. His sudden happiness made the maid drop her dishes on the floor, and she started apologizing in terror. Raphael was embarrassed. The girl was shaking so much from fear that he tried to calm her down. But when she started begging him not to punish her, the guy realized the former prince was just a spoiled brat. But when the maid admitted she'd always been punished on the prince's orders, the new Raphael was horrified. It became clear that while the crown prince was exiled from the imperial palace, he took out all his anger on the staff. Looks like making new friends won't be easy for the heir, so the guy told the girl to leave his bedroom, and she was honestly thrilled. Raphael called Pierrot over and demanded he tell him the whole truth about his behavior, pretending the elixir had messed with his memory a bit. But when Pierrot tried to lie, the prince threatened him with a poisonous brew, making the doctor think twice about what to say. With no other choice, the man confessed that the prince loved making people kneel before him and do whatever he wanted. Hearing all those nasty details, Cheonsak was horrified. None of this was in the book, and now he was stuck in the body of a monster. What was really surprising was that, despite the prince's insane behavior, Pierrot had always stayed by his side. The man admitted he always knew what the prince was really like, because he remembered one creepy stormy night when he searched for the little heir in the garden. Turns out, Raphael had left the warm estate that night just to save a lost chick in the bushes, and that convinced the doctor the boy had a good heart. For years, he believed that once the prince recovered, he'd go back to being the caring and loving person he used to be. Maybe not all hope is lost. Now that Raphael has a new soul, the former Cheonsak will do everything he can so loyal people like Pierrot never have to feel betrayed. Their conversation was suddenly cut off when the butler burst into the room, saying the emperor wanted to see his son. It took the prince a few days to reach the emperor's main estate. On his way to meet his father, the guy felt determined. After all, he knew a lot of secrets from the novel. The throne room was empty except for the ruler himself, but he didn't exactly look happy to see the heir return. Taros had ruled the lands of Magentano for decades, but barely spent any time raising his kids. But now he was worried because his eldest son was surrounded by Rahan energy, even though he was a total weakling. Still, some things never change. His kid was just as shaky as ever in front of his father in that intimidating glare. The emperor wouldn't let him get up off his knees, just started casually chatting about life at the country palace. When his father brought up the rumors, the guy started justifying his random experiments, saying they were all for his health. Taros wasn't about to put up with this kind of mockery of the imperial bloodline, so he ordered the prince to think about his dignity for once. That's why Raphael was stunned when his father said he needed to make a smart choice in the fight for the crown, since his body wouldn't last much longer. Turns out, this whole meeting was just a cover. The emperor had decided it was time to make a final call on his successor. And when the man said he saw his younger son on the throne, Raphael immediately said he wouldn't give up the crown just because he was told to. Never before had this little pup dared talk back to his father, so Taros was furious at his son's boldness. All his life, the prince had been under his father's thumb, but now it was time to stop being afraid. Still, if the emperor wanted to pick his heir himself, he could just take the crown from Raphael, no questions asked. This whole meeting was just an excuse to force the older son to publicly acknowledge his brother's authority. Everyone thinks the first prince is weak and hopeless, and the emperor's plan to swap heirs is a smart political move. But Raphael isn't going down without a fight. Openly defying the order pissed Taros off, making him get up from the throne and walk toward his son, looking ready to explode. The man meant business. He couldn't let a sick cripple destroy everything he'd built in the empire. Honestly, the guy didn't even care about the title. He was rich, could hand power to his brother, and just live out his days in comfort. But in the novel, when Theodore, the emperor's second son, took the throne, chaos swallowed the whole land. Raphael knew that kind of rule would ruin the empire, and the Magentano family would disappear from the political scene. So the guy told his father that his brains and wisdom more than made up for his weak body. And he was sure that if his father gave him a chance to prove himself, he'd do everything for the family and protect them. Piero got worried when his ward came back to the bedroom but didn't say a word about meeting his father. After thinking for a bit, the prince admitted he might have lost his title as heir, which totally shocked the doctor. The man was about to pass out from shock, but the guy took pity on him and explained he'd made a bet with the emperor, and actually won the fight for the throne. Then he perked up and asked the doctor to start prepping him for a duel with his younger brother. But instead of supporting him, Piero broke down in tears and started packing his things. He was sure he'd get kicked out of the palace once the older prince died in the duel. Taros was surprised to see his son, but he couldn't just ignore the duel request. This was the first time his kid actually showed some backbone, something he'd always tried to crush. Meanwhile, Raphael's bedroom was filled with arguing. He was trying to convince the doctor to trust his plan and stop packing up. A few weeks later, every noble in the city gathered on the main bridge to watch the heirs face off in a duel. The Imperial Council, led by Taros, announced the start of the duel and the crowd went wild. Even though the man didn't share their excitement, his relationship with his sons was complicated. Those were still his kids down there. The emperor could see that, even though Raphael was the older one. Next to Theodore, he just looked like a clueless kid about to get beat up. While the crowd cheered for the second prince, he walked up to his brother and told him to back out while he still could. Everyone knew who was going to win. But Raphael stayed calm. His brother's cockiness didn't bother him. He had a solid plan. The younger prince was sure this duel was just their dad's way of giving both heirs a fair shot and earning the nobles' respect. But Theodore had already decided he'd won, so his concern for his brother's health was just for show in front of the emperor. Raphael was determined to shatter everyone's idea of him as weak, so he grabbed Piero's shield and demanded the fight begin. The emperor and his aide were stunned by the guts of the prince they'd always pitied, but the father noticed the unfamiliar weapon in his son's hands. Theodore did everything he could, but if his older brother was set on dying, he wasn't going to talk him out of it anymore. But Raphael slammed the shield on the ground a few times, sending a threatening screech through the air, and promised to fight with everything he had. The crowd started whispering that the younger prince was a real fighter. He'd trained with the best knight in the country, while the older one was just going to embarrass himself. When Piero found out about his young master's plan, he was suspicious, even though his charge was dead serious. The man tried to encourage the prince, but his voice shook every time he pictured how badly the duel could end. Suddenly, Raphael said he'd win the duel if he could block just 3 of his brother's attacks. Piero had done everything he could, so all he could do now was pray that luck would be on his master's side today. Emperor Taros announced that the duel between his sons would mark the start of a new era for the Magentano Empire. Maybe the man wasn't as hyped as the regular crowd, so he just laid out the main rules of the match. The oldest son, Raphael, had to last 5 minutes, either defending or attacking. But if the prince gave in to his younger brother's strength, the right to the throne would go to Theodore. The crowd went wild. Duels for the throne almost never happened in the capital, especially with one of the heirs being a sickly cripple. But out of nowhere, Raphael tossed his sword aside, leaving everyone in the stands totally stunned. The younger prince actually felt relieved. He'd really struggled with the idea of raising his sword against someone so sick, and he hoped his brother would just surrender. Even though Raphael took a defensive stance, Theodore still decided to start the fight. After all, their father was watching, and he couldn't disgrace the family's honor. The younger prince powered up his Rahan energy, channeling all his mana into his sword. If his brother wanted to defend, he'd show him real strength. Energy surged through his whole body, and with his weapon raised, he charged straight at Raphael. Taros could see that the younger son had put all his mana into strength and speed, which meant the older brother's shield wouldn't hold up. Theodore aimed his strike from above on purpose, hoping his brother would drop to one knee and keep some dignity, instead of looking like a total weakling. Pierrot and the nobles were stunned when they saw the sickly heir actually dodge that powerful blow. A lot of people thought the younger prince was just going easy on his brother, but the truth was Raphael had poured all his mana into his shield. But Theodore knew this wasn't just luck. His brother definitely had some kind of defensive strategy. Another surge of energy wrapped around the younger prince's sword, and he started hammering at his brother's defense with fury. This time, the hit was way stronger, and it sent the first prince flying to the side. Struggling to his feet, the guy tried to shake off the dizziness, clearly hurting and with an injured arm. Back in the day, Cheonsak was a cop. He used to get roughed up by vandals at protests all the time, so taking hits from his brother was no big deal. Theodore went all in, attacking non-stop, but Raphael didn't expect his brother to absorb his mana that fast. The younger one had no clue what the prince was planning, but in their dad's eyes, he had to see it through. So he channeled the last of his mana into his sword and struck the shield again. And luckily for Raphael, his legs held out and he didn't go down. The stat hologram showed that his newly healed organs actually survived the hit. Raphael's shield was custom-made by the palace blacksmith, built to hold all his mana inside. And on top of that, the prince had downed a wild mix of booze the night before. The brothers' showdown was epic, but only their father saw that all their power was focused in their Rahan energy. Suddenly, Theodore backed off, red blotches spreading across his face as his breathing got shaky. From the novel's plot, Cheonsak remembered that Raphael's brother was super sensitive to alcohol. The younger one started to feel worse. He'd just hit the shield, but now he was swaying, barely holding it together. After all, only by winning could Theodore earn his father's respect and claim the title of Crown Prince. But more importantly, the future of the empire needed strong hands. Otherwise, sickly Raphael might die before he even got the title. For respect and his own glory, Theodore had to beat his brother right in front of the nobles. The younger one unleashed a powerful strike, but his sword just slammed into the armored shield again. Raphael couldn't figure out why his booze cocktail wasn't working on his brother. The guy was fighting like a madman, running on pure willpower. So the prince pumped even more alcohol into his shield's energy, and suddenly Theodore was tripping, seeing himself in some random bar. Raphael's heart was ready to fire off another shot of booze energy. His master had trained it well. When Theodore got another dose, the organ joked that all the drinks were on the house, courtesy of another guest. But the guy didn't realize that foreign Rahan energy had slipped into his body, and Raphael was draining his strength. The younger prince was stunned when the hallucinations stopped, but he still had no idea what he'd been poisoned with. Raphael tossed his shield aside. Time for the final blow while he still had mana left. He focused the alcohol energy into his palm and slammed it straight into his little brother's heart. The energy burst was so powerful, it sent Theodore flying to the other side of the arena. The crowd fell silent, and Emperor Taros was horrified to see his strongest son lying on the ground. But no one could deny that the guy once branded a cripple, Raphael, now looked healthier than anyone here. The match wasn't technically over yet, but everyone could tell the victory was the elder heir's. The emperor tried to convince himself he'd imagined the Rahan energy, but it was real. Raphael's power core had awakened. Waves of faint energy rippled from every social class, but the man ignored them. Even from that far away, the emperor could feel his own Rahan reacting to his son's mana. It was obvious Raphael had won, so he rushed over to his brother and started checking his injuries. Even though the prince had poisoned his own mana with alcohol, he decided to spare his younger brother the hangover and other symptoms, pulling the booze back into himself. Suddenly, Theodore noticed his sickly brother had a cut on his forehead and started worrying he'd get sick again. The younger prince was shocked that his brother had fought so hard and even came up with a battle strategy. Meanwhile, he'd just mocked his brother's injuries and smugly assumed he'd win. But that didn't stop the elder brother from helping Theodore, and now the guy felt ashamed for underestimating him. So the second prince knelt before the heir and declared, in front of everyone, that he accepted defeat and wouldn't claim the throne. The crowd's brief confusion turned into cheers and shouts for the true prince. Raphael had prepared for anything, but since he'd pulled it off, he had to live up to the council's and his father's trust, especially now that his father couldn't ignore him anymore. Piero couldn't hold back tears of joy. His student had finally proved to everyone that a weak body wasn't a death sentence for a ruler. The hologram said the prince could boost his health now by healing other people, and honestly, that seemed like his best shot for a while. If he used this new technique right, Raphael wouldn't have to steal anyone's energy. He could just create more by taking away their sickness. But all those old tricks with poisonous elixirs and needles? Total waste of time. The guy got so lost in his thoughts, he didn't even notice his father coming down from the stands. The man was holding back his anger. He needed to make sure of what he'd seen because you can't just activate Rahan energy out of nowhere. But when his son casually admitted he had no idea how his power worked, that just pissed the emperor off even more. When Teros's firstborn was born, he personally placed the Rahan core in him, but because the kid's body was weak, the family power never showed up. And now, at the most crucial moment for the empire, his son unlocked that power, and it ruined all of his father's plans, leaving him feeling helpless. To get his dad off his back, the prince had to just agree to all his ridiculous accusations. But an emperor's word is law, and before leaving, his father promised Raphael would keep his status as heir, but he'd be keeping a close eye on him. And if the prince couldn't handle the weight of ruling, Teros would personally exile him from the empire. But his father's harsh words didn't scare Raphael. He was more worried about the man's health. He'd started smoking a lot and eating poorly. Maybe right now the man wasn't ready to listen to his son's advice. But the prince had to try and help the ruler change his habits. After the heir's duel ended, the emperor's carriage headed out to the country estate. Teros was furious his son had recklessly used such dangerous energy. One wrong move with that weak body could have ended badly. When Raphael was born, his mother died right away, and the lonely boy kept getting sick all the time. For years, his father waited for any sign of progress from his heir, but the kid just kept letting him down. But today, for the first time, Teros saw a spark of hope in his son's eyes, and it made him remember a father's love he'd long forgotten. After winning the duel, Raphael left his father's estate and decided to head back to his small mansion. In the novel, the emperor died of a stroke, and it reminded Chainsock of his own past. He'd lost his father to the same disease. If we follow the story, the death of his son will leave a huge scar on the man's heart, and the pain of loss will make him seriously ill. Besides his ideas about prolonging life, Raphael has to do whatever it takes to make sure his father's strong enough to protect the empire. The guy was already thinking about what to do next, when suddenly Piero started freaking out again. The man was honestly moved by the prince's wisdom and the kindness Raphael showed his younger brother. The guy slapped the doctor a few times to snap him out of it. They had a dangerous mission in the city ahead, and they needed to stay focused. A few days had passed since the duel, and people in the capital had finally stopped gossiping about it. Life was back to normal. Raphael took Piero to one of the best restaurants in the empire, but the guy was way too nervous about being there. Still, what really bothered the doctor was why the prince was wearing a wig and trying to hide his identity with all those accessories. When the waitress came over, the prince just ordered something normal to keep things casual. Then he gave her a code word, and she invited them to follow her to another room. The waitress opened a secret passage hidden behind a wine cabinet and hinted that the show had already started. Raphael relaxed a bit. Turns out what was written in the book was true, but it was still hard to believe he was surrounded by a different world. The hidden staircase went several floors underground, which freaked Piero out, since he had no idea the prince knew about these underground places. When they stepped out onto a small balcony, the prince said they needed to find Damien, a special friend from the future. But when the doctor saw the arena, he was stunned. Right in the middle of the capital, there were secret gladiator fights going on. Raphael was blown away by the wild, intense atmosphere. It was way more epic than he'd ever imagined. The waitress announced that the show was starting, but the prince still couldn't spot the gladiator he was looking for. Suddenly, Piero screamed in terror when the crowd roared and a huge, scarred brute appeared in the arena. But that wasn't Damien. so the two of them kept scanning the crowd. Then, on the other side of the arena, the doors swung open, and there he was. Damien, the main character from the Devil's Sword novel. They cleared the last defeated fighters off the arena so the next pair of gladiators could come out. The announcer, looking a little nervous, rushed to the center to kick off the next match. The crowd was hyped for this one. Most of the bets were on Damien, and over the past 6 months, he'd become the undisputed champ. The doors on the far side of the arena burst open, and a massive troll charged out, ready to crush anyone in his way. This new world blew Raphael's mind. He'd never seen a real troll before. Pierrot was freaking out. He grabbed the prince by the jacket and tried to drag him back to the restaurant. But then the gong sounded, and the hungry troll lunged at his opponent, looking to make him a quick snack. Damien was a crazy skilled swordsman, so dodging a few heavy punches was no big deal for him. But suddenly, the beast managed to grab Damien by the shoulder and tried to crush him. Out of nowhere, a sword sliced through the air, sharp as a razor, and cut the monster clean in half. Damien stayed calm and ruthless, and that's exactly why the crowd loved his fighting style. The shredded monster hit the ground, and the crowd went wild. Victory cries echoed around the arena, and the fans started demanding the champ face an even tougher opponent. Without saying a word, Damien headed back under the stands, but Raphael decided he had to meet the gladiator right now. That's why Damien was the hero of the story. His toughness and sword skills were exactly what the prince needed. Pierrot was still terrified, but he obediently followed his young master down into the dungeons. Every gladiator had their own room, but the champ's cell was the only one guarded by a sentry. Still, a small gold bar was all it took to get the guard to leave and watch the hallway instead. Wasting no time, the prince burst into Damien's room where the gladiator was patching up some minor wounds. Keeping his cool, Raphael grabbed a jar of pills and said a warrior this skilled deserved way better treatment. The warrior wasn't happy to see guests and bluntly told them to get out of his cell before he cut the stranger down with his sword. But the prince was one cocky guy, so he just started talking about some new medicine he had, which pissed Damien off enough to reach for his sword. Raphael knew the champ suffered from brutal headaches, so he launched into a whole lecture about how to fix his health. To back up his words, the prince even dared to show off a few massage techniques on the gladiator's neck. The guy got so into character, he started listing every symptom he'd ever read about in a novel. Sometimes he'd even act things out, like showing how you could choke and nobody would be there to save the warrior. Then he rattled off all the scary consequences that could hit Damien's body like a tidal wave. And in the end, Damien would die the most painful death this world could ever imagine. The gladiator had no idea how this clown got into his room, but there was a lot of truth in what he was saying. The man was about ready to kill the chatty merchant, but he knew his current treatment wasn't working. And to convince the gladiator he could be trusted, Raphael admitted he was the crown prince of the empire. But the gladiator drew his sword and decided he'd better get rid of this joker before he brought trouble to his cell. So the prince had to think fast and lied that he'd been sent by Master Kuzman, who was worried about Damien's health. Noticing his lie worked, the guy immediately offered to try out his new treatment method. Damien had no clue what was going on. He barely talked to anyone outside the Colosseum, so he didn't know if he could trust this stranger. But Raphael was persistent, so he told his new patient to take off his armor and get ready for the procedure. For a second, the guy hesitated. Damien's body was covered in scars, but it was time to finally get rid of the mark. The prince pulled out a firestone and placed it on the warrior's back, and for once, the fearless champ looked scared of this weird treatment. And the crazy look in his new healer's eyes as he grabbed a torch from the wall didn't help at all. Damien said he was a warrior and could handle any procedure. This couldn't be any worse than a sword fight. But in the next second, the dungeon hallway echoed with horrible screams of pain, making both Pierrot and the guard freeze in fear. Raphael had warned about the risks, but seeing the great gladiator fighting back tears, it looked more like torture than healing. The main point of the firestone was to break the mark that kept the gladiator trapped in the underworld, making him feel pain every time he got hurt. Years of brutal battles in the Colosseum had put Damien's body through hell. Raphael also knew the gladiator's master only gave him medicine in exchange for fights, trapping the warrior in a vicious cycle. If the prince could cure all the gladiators from this awful curse, he'd end up living longer himself. When the procedure was over, Damien was shaking from the pain, but the mark was still burned into his back. The guy was sure his treatment had helped the warrior, and Damien should be getting fewer headaches now. And to Damien's surprise, his body felt looser, and the wounds from his last fight weren't bothering him as much. Now that the prince had some leverage over the gladiator, he offered a deal. Let him do a few more treatments. But the warrior said he had to fight every day and couldn't do that with his back all burned up, which pissed Raphael off. Still, the guy figured as long as Damien had a master, he'd never finish his medical experiment, so he had to get the gladiator out. The man was sure the stranger was just another hustler and started doubting he even knew Kuzman. Raphael bragged he wasn't lying. He really was a prince, loaded with cash and next in line for the throne. But Damien figured this cocky attitude meant he was getting dragged into another scheme that would leave him owing someone again. The prince got mad and ordered the gladiator to stay in his room that night, even if he heard fighting in the dungeon. The guy just hoped his plan would work. He just needed the gladiator to follow his orders. Suddenly, Damien dropped to one knee and promised to follow the stranger, since it was the first time anyone had helped him. Heading back through the dungeons to the arena, Pierrot tried to figure out what his master was up to. After all, treating underground gladiators wasn't a prince's job. The group made their way to a small bar near the Colosseum and started looking for Kuzman. Pierrot was keeping his eyes peeled. There were drunk strangers everywhere, but he was looking for a slave owner with long hair. Raphael was shocked. The guy from the novel looked exactly like him in real life, and even his menacing face gave off the same terrifying vibe. Mustering all his courage, the prince sat down at Kuzman's table and jumped right into asking him about the fights. Kuzman's nasty glare wasn't helping, so Raphael just came out and said he was ready to buy Damien, debts and all. But the slave owner shot back that his legionaries were worth the emperor's entire fortune, and no spoiled noble kid could afford that. When the prince left, Kuzman called his assistant over and told him to tail the guy. He'd never seen this stranger at the fights before, but then he decided no one was allowed to mess with his gladiators and ordered his men to get rid of the scrawny brat. Barely a couple hours after that order, the bar doors suddenly burst open and Kuzman's assistant's lifeless body hit the floor at his feet. Kuzman tried to wake the mercenary up, but realized the guy had been dead for a while. That's when he noticed a whole squad of armed knights walking into the bar, clearly Imperial guards. And finally, Raphael ripped off his wig and ordered everyone to stay put. He was a secret Imperial inspector, and the underground games were over. A couple hours earlier, when the prince and Pierrot left the restaurant, Pierrot noticed someone was following them. Kuzman was predictable, even in the novel, so it was obvious he'd send a mercenary to dig up some info. That's exactly why Raphael started talking to him at the bar, to make him feel threatened and slip up. The mercenary was hiding around the corner when he saw his target stop, so he drew his blade, ready to take care of business. But right then, an Imperial guard showed up out of nowhere and knocked the dagger from his hand. A whole squad of guards followed, and their captain accused the mercenary of trying to kill a member of the Imperial family. Kuzman's mistake let the soldiers raid the underground Colosseum to find out who else was in on the plot against the ruler. Now Kuzman had to run. He'd been way too cocky, not believing the kid's big talk about being a prince. Pierrot had no idea what was going on with his master all day, and this new inspector title just left him even more confused. Raphael handed the guard captain his inspector badge and told him to block every exit out of the bar. The slave owner started to panic. His whole operation was about to go down if he didn't get out and take the gladiators with him. Suddenly, he heard a shout. The Imperial prince was ordering the guards to destroy the Colosseum and arrest everyone involved in the fights. Then the prince pointed at Kuzman and demanded they catch him alive and bring him in for questioning. Without wasting a second, the guards took off after the fight organizers before they could disappear into the tunnels. The raid was going exactly like the prince predicted, and Pierrot was honestly shocked at how much his master had changed. Raphael was stoked. Not only did he do the cop's job for them, he also managed to catch the top bosses of the local mafia. In the chaos, Kuzman slipped through a hidden door that led straight to the underground. While the slave owner rushed to the secret exit, he decided he'd lay low for a while and come back for Damien later. But right behind the hidden door, knights' swords were already waiting for him. And to make things worse, among the guards he spotted the prince himself, who clearly knew exactly where he'd try to run. Pierrot lost the bet and had to pay the prince back, even though he was seriously impressed by his master's brains. Raphael felt totally safe surrounded by the guards, so he just laughed at Kuzman's dumb escape attempt. Then, with a cold voice, he warned the slave owner to accept his terms if he wanted to get out of that filthy basement alive. But Kuzman wasn't about to give up his gladiators. He suddenly drew his blades and lunged at the crown prince. The guard captain jumped in front of Raphael and dropped the criminal to the floor with a single strike. The guards drew their swords again and warned Kuzman to stay put, or they'd execute him right there. Realizing he was out of options, the man decided to use the poison capsule he'd hidden under his dental crown. If he could bite it open and spit it out, the poison would paralyze all his enemies and he'd have a shot at escaping. Then the prince would be left alone, and Kuzman could finish him off with a few quick strikes. The plan was perfect, and Kuzman almost managed to spit out the capsule. when suddenly the prince's hand clamped over his mouth. The poison had already started spreading through his body, and the slave owner collapsed to the floor, slowly getting paralyzed. He could have survived if he used the antidote, but the prince knew that too. So he snatched the potion right out of the man's hands. Using the last of his strength, Kuzmin tried to grab the life-saving elixir back, but his arms were already frozen by the paralysis. All he could do now was watch as the prince drank his antidote with a smug, almost cruel smile. Some strange, raspy cries escaped Kuzmin's mouth, but his last bit of hope faded. There was only one antidote. Of course, Raphael knew he could heal the criminal with his mana, but he wanted the guy to suffer a little more first. The slave owner started to black out, foam bubbling from his mouth, a sign the poison was about to stop his heart. His lifeless body dropped right at Raphael's feet, and the guy figured if he healed the man now, he'd earn some health points. Using what he'd learned in the past, the prince found the frozen nerve on Kuzmin's back and pressed hard, jump-starting his heart. The next second, the criminal's body jerked, and he started coughing like crazy, spitting poison all over the floor. Raphael sent a bit of the antidote through his Rahan energy, completely healing Kuzmin. The man had no idea what was happening. He'd literally seen the light at the end of the tunnel, but now he was breathing again. The experiment worked. The system reported that for saving someone's life, Raphael's own life had been extended by 2 weeks. The slave owner was useless to him now, so the prince ordered the guards to haul him off to the capital's prison. Chaos ruled the gladiator dungeons. Every legionnaire had gathered to fight off the attack from the imperial guards. Damien was barely holding the line to protect his friends, but more guards kept coming, trapping them deeper in the dungeon. Another squad came down to the basement, but this time the man recognized a familiar healer, though he looked different now. That meant the gladiator's new friend hadn't lied. He was really here to get him out of the Colosseum's slavery. Damien never believed in luck before, and he still kinda doesn't. But he decided this was his sign to change his life. The gladiator lost his mother young and was left alone against the world, and at the same time, he lost his freedom too. For years, he dreamed of being alone again, just disappearing somewhere on the far edge of the empire. The darkness in his mind faded, and Damien woke up in a clean bed, in a bedroom he didn't recognize. Pierrot was relieved his new charge hadn't died, and promised to take care of his health and comfort. But the prince didn't want to waste time on introductions. He ordered the ex-gladiator to follow him to another room. The man watched as his new acquaintances argued about something, but since they'd saved his life, he figured he owed it to them to at least listen to their offer. Turned out, the guest room in Raphael's palace had a small infirmary set up, where Damien ran into all his old friends from the Colosseum. He had no idea what was going on. They'd been rescued, fed, and allowed to stay in the small palace. Some of the gladiators didn't trust the prince. After all, they were outcasts, and he was just wasting his time on them. But Raphael wasn't doing this out of kindness. He needed test subjects to develop his Rahan energy. If he could cure all the warriors from the cursed mark, by his calculations, he'd get 3 years of his life back. Still, he couldn't tell the patients the truth, so he made up a story about running some experimental treatment. Suddenly, one of the gladiators in the crowd shouted that everyone in the empire knew the prince was a sickly weakling who'd kick the bucket soon. Raphael told a sad story about how nobody in the world could heal him, so now he had to take his health into his own hands. That's when Damien realized that the warm bed and food came with a price. They'd have to take part in the prince's experiments. Everyone started getting nervous. One gladiator told the others about the first procedure, and it seemed to calm them down. After all, they wanted the pain to stop too. That little bit of trust from the fighters helped, so Raphael could get started right away with the stone therapy. All week, the patients went through experiments, and honestly, they were ready to bolt from the small palace at any moment. But the prince saw another problem. After so much pain medication, all his patients acted like addicts going through withdrawal. What really stood out, though, was how Damien handled it. He toughed it out, while the others looked like zombies. The man admitted he tried to spend his time meditating, otherwise he'd get nauseous and probably pass out. The prince never expected that kind of willpower. Now it made sense why Damien was the main character in the novel. Anyway, it was time to switch up the treatment, so after telling his patients to get some sleep, Raphael left the infirmary. The next day, one of the gladiators was still dealing with withdrawal, so the prince decided to try out a new technique on him. The guy pulled out a set of needles for therapy and explained to the man that he was about to stick a few into his body. Honestly, the prince wasn't sure acupuncture would work, but he had to at least ease the lighter symptoms. But after just a couple needles, the gladiator suddenly jumped off the bed and lunged at the prince. Like a rabid tiger, the guy slammed him to the ground and started choking him with everything he had. Raphael tried to throw him off, but the guy was a mountain of muscle, totally out of his mind. The prince was about to black out when suddenly there was a loud crack, and the gladiator's body collapsed to the floor. Damien had spotted the fight just in time while everyone else was asleep and managed to help the heir to the throne. Because of the withdrawal syndrome, the prince figured acupuncture might mess with the nervous system. Most likely, even the gladiator's nerve endings were messed up by Kuzman's pills, so he needed a different approach. To avoid irritating the nerves, the prince decided he'd have to make thinner needles. Late that evening, Raphael got a letter from the local blacksmith who said he was ready to take the order. But the smith warned right away that he didn't have the tools to make a whole set of identical needles. The guy started freaking out. If he couldn't find a way to cure the syndrome, all his patients could die. The health system kicked in, and all the healthy organs gathered for a meeting. Looks like their owner was panicking, so they'd have to send him a notification about how to use health points. Raphael was pumped when the hologram suggested he could use health points to summon a magical monster with any ability he needed. Suddenly, a few secret boxes appeared in the air, each one holding a different creature inside. After reading all the descriptions, the guy felt awkward. None of them were even close to what he actually needed. So the prince spent the whole night thinking about which creature to pick. The Council of Organs was sick of waiting, and the heart insisted they absolutely had to choose the third box with the hedgehog. Sparks lit up the air, swirling around the secret box, and then there was a soft pop. A tiny creature dropped right into Raphael's hands, way too cute to be called a monster. The system said the hedgehog came with a bonus pack of seeds that could boost its growth depending on the situation. According to the manual, this adorable pet could turn into a fierce warrior, but right now, the prince just wanted its quills. The animal listened to its master's request and fired off 3 different kinds of spikes. Unfortunately for the prince, the quills stuck in his hand, and for a second, he thought his whole arm went numb. The white and yellow spikes just stung a bit, but the black one gave off some creepy energy. Definitely made for torture. Now Raphael was basically a superhero, with a loyal pet that could help him save his own life. The guy headed back to the infirmary to test out the new quills, but Pierrot immediately started grilling him about the hedgehog. The animal seemed happy to meet everyone, but the prince had to lie again, saying he just found it while wandering through the bushes. But the healer didn't buy his story this time either. There were just too many coincidences. Pierrot knew the old legends about the Empire's greatest architect, who supposedly had animal helpers centuries ago. And if that's true, then this hedgehog might be a summoned monster that picked its own master. And now Pierrot needed to keep a closer eye on the prince. In the morning, the gladiator really regretted what happened. The prince had been so kind to him and the others, and now they might all get kicked out. But now Raphael felt calm. With the hedgehog's quills, he could finally do the procedure right. All day, the guy watched over the infirmary and gave acupuncture to every patient from the Colosseum. By the end of the day, all the cursed marks were gone from the ex-gladiators. But the prince's life only got 3 months longer. Damien always kept an eye on Raphael, and seeing him happy now just didn't make sense. He'd only healed a bunch of outcasts. Plus, after curing so many people, the prince leveled up his medic skills, and his hologram pinged with a health update. Now that his loyal gladiators were feeling better, he had to keep them close and put them to use. Emperor Taro set up a meeting with a messenger who brought news from the small palace about the prince's actions. The man couldn't figure out why his son saved a dozen gladiators who now acted as his personal bodyguards. Raphael used to be a sickly cripple, but now he'd built his own squad of tough guys, and the emperor ordered an investigation into their terms. The messenger also reported that lately, the prince had been chasing after the servants and doing some weird needle procedures on them. Taros figured this wasn't just madness anymore. His heir clearly had some secret plan, so he decided to double the spies in the small palace. The small palace's procedure room turned into the prince's personal lab for non-stop experiments. Every servant in the estate went through his treatments, and the guy managed to buy himself a few more days of life. After Raphael healed the gladiators, he spent a lot of time wandering the garden, thinking about the future. His peace was interrupted by Damien, who decided to stay at the palace after getting treated. Unfortunately for the prince, all his patients were healthy now, so he had nowhere to draw energy for his own body, meaning the gladiators had to go. The swordsman took it as a sign. Since someone else's mercy had run out, it was time for him to leave as soon as possible. But Raphael immediately started convincing him to stay and use his fighting skills for protection. The deal sounded good. The prince promised a salary and respect on the job, and he didn't care about loyalty since ex-gladiators weren't exactly known for honor. Truth is, Damien was about to unlock the most extreme swordmaster skill, and the prince wanted a warrior like that by his side. With that kind of power, Damien's body would have a hard time coping, and treating the side effects would help Raphael level up his own skills. Raphael promised to stick to the contract and give noble payments to a guy who'd just been rotting in the basement. Damien appreciated the prince's negotiation skills, but he also noticed a faint rustle in the bushes behind him. Suddenly, a whole crowd of gladiators showed up behind the guy, begging him to let them join his crew. Sure, mercenaries loving money says a lot about them, but even without the swordsman around, they could still have his back. The Imperial Guard might help the prince out, but their loyalty will always be to his father. Right now, Raphael needed to gather people who were loyal to him and him alone, so he didn't care if they were just in it for the cash. Looks like the mercs actually appreciated finally having a real job, and one that could give them a good life too. But all the celebration didn't do much for the guy. As long as he couldn't add years to his life, he was just racing against death. And with how weak his body was, going out to find patients would be tough, so he'd have to bring the sick right to the palace. Honestly, it was a genius idea. If Raphael could open a clinic inside the small palace, he could keep himself going. So he called Damien and Pierrot into his office and laid out the plan in detail. Of course, he left out the whole reincarnation thing, but Pierrot still seemed really impressed that his master's kind heart had won out. The prince played along, promising the doctor he'd do everything he could to heal the sick and helpless for the good of the empire's future. The guy decided he'd start by curing all the servants working in the main palace. For now, the small palace looked more like a fortress than any kind of public clinic. And if he managed to heal the servants from the capital, they'd definitely spread the word, which would help with publicity. But a week later, all the prince's dreams of free advertising got crushed. Turns out, every single servant was perfectly healthy. He spent sleepless nights checking up on patients, but only managed to earn himself 2 extra days of life. So he ordered his assistants to gather info about the families of the people he'd already examined. If there were no sick people inside the palace, he'd find some among the servants' kids and elders. Hours of sorting through profiles led nowhere. Those folks were healthy too. Damien noticed the disappointment on the prince's face and said he just didn't get what the prince was after. For some reason, the guy was sure his boss had some hidden agenda and the patients were just tools. Raphael froze. He'd hoped he wasn't that obvious. But once he started looking for people on the brink of death, it was hard to hide his motive. Pierrot didn't like the harsh accusation against the heir and told the mercenary to chill out. But he had to come clean, so the prince said his plan had a lot of layers and told the doctor to stay out of his business. Suddenly, Damien jumped in to defend Pierrot, since he thought the prince was being way too rude to the staff. Then Pierrot snapped at the mercenary for daring to tell his master how to treat the servants. That's when Raphael lost it and kicked both of his assistants out into the hallway. He only had a few applications left, and if none of them were patients, his whole plan to open the clinic would fall apart. And then, in the last questionnaire, there was a letter from a servant saying her brother was having strange seizures. The whole family thought he was possessed by a demon, and even the priests refused to pray for him. This was exactly what Raphael was looking for. A hopeless case, wrapped up in fear and superstition. The next morning, the servant brought her little brother to meet the prince. Georg was a bit scared of the meeting, but at first glance, he didn't look sick. Since Raphael had worked with kids before, he tried to be friendly and really listened to the boy's story. He knew the kid had never been to the palace, and if he didn't help him relax, he'd never get all the symptoms out of him. So the prince offered the young patient a chocolate, and you could tell Georg wanted to take it but was scared. The boy said no one was allowed to touch him and he couldn't accept the gift. Georg was convinced he was possessed by an evil spirit, just like his family believed. Because of that, a lot of kids thought he was a weirdo who could spread his curse just by touching them. After a fight with some bullies, the boy got into a scuffle, but right after that, his whole body started shaking. Then, like always, he blacked out and it felt like he was falling into a deep sleep. The story really got to Raphael, so he couldn't help but hug the boy, trying to comfort him. While he was scanning Georg's body with mana, he kept telling him he was just a normal kid. When the system said the boy's body was healthy, but his weak energy flow made him prone to zoning out, Raphael recognized the illness. No obvious symptoms at first, but during heavy stress, it could trigger seizures. The prince assured him there were no demons inside, and that made the boy so happy. He also promised he knew how to fix Georg's health since he understood the cause. Sure, if he had modern tools, he'd find the problem easily. But right now, the kid's emotions were making him shake. It all happened so fast. Raphael hadn't even done anything yet, and the boy's body was already collapsing to the floor. The nurse and the prince's aides rushed over, but Raphael told everyone to calm down. But Damien had already drawn his sword, thinking the demon rumors were true and they needed to deal with the threat. The prince was pissed. The kid was just sick and needed help, so he ordered his aides to bring blankets and pillows. They laid Georg on the floor, but no one stopped him from fighting through the seizure. Piero was worried. He was a doctor, but there was nothing he could do, so he just tried to support the boy's head. But Raphael told him not to touch the kid when he noticed some kind of energy forming around him. The boy's whole body looked like it was on fire, but it was actually a surge of Rahan energy. So the prince decided to link his own energy flow with the boy's, hoping to find out the real cause of the illness. Inside the mana, he saw chaos, clumps of energy flying randomly through the nerves. Raphael followed a nerve pulsing with mana, but it was clearly out of Georg's control. The foreign energy was draining him, and the prince felt like he might pass out himself. But he still managed to reach the central nerve cluster, even though it was cramping up too. It was all about the vagus nerve, and when Raphael snapped out of his energy trance, he realized how to treat the patient. He couldn't start the treatment until the seizure was over, so he told his assistants to cover the boy up and leave him alone. But the very next second, the prince collapsed to the floor, unconscious, and the system said he'd just lost a few days of his life. Late at night, Raphael finally woke up in his own room, but his body felt completely drained. Damien stepped out of the shadows, scaring the prince half to death. But he was just doing his job as a bodyguard. Jumping out of bed, Raphael decided he needed to find the local mage ASAP before his patient had another attack. Even though he was weak, Raphael was actually relieved. He'd figured out the cause of the illness. Now all he needed was to get struck by lightning and he could cure Georg. The prince, with his bodyguard in tow, arrived at the magic tower, but the guards blocked his way. Raphael ordered them to let him through. He had urgent business with Mage Tease. Realizing this really was the heir, the guards personally escorted him to the wizard's quarters. Raphael impatiently threw open the wooden doors, the crash jolting Tease awake in terror. The old man had no idea what was going on. The prince was supposed to be in a different palace altogether. But there was no time for long explanations, so Raphael just demanded his help right away. And he confidently told the mage to hit him with lightning to unlock his mana powers. Tease was stunned. That request sounded like a death sentence for the already half-dead prince. Just a day earlier, the emperor himself had told the wizard that his eldest son seemed to have lost his mind. The prince's unpredictability made Taras worry about the future of the palace. And now, with Raphael showing up in the middle of the night demanding lightning in his bedroom, the old man was at a total loss. Raphael explained he just needed a small jolt, and nobody would punish the mage for it. There wouldn't be enough electricity to kill him anyway. Mages of the Empire can generate lightning from natural energy, but lightning is super destructive, so it's tough to keep a weak charge going for hours. Not wanting to give the prince false hope, Tease said there's always a risk of losing control over the energy. But even without the warning, Raphael knew he was basically putting a mage behind the wheel of a Ferrari right in the middle of a race. And to cheer up the old man, the prince praised all his achievements for the Empire. Tease relaxed under the compliments, since the imperial heir is never this polite. Right now, he was actually being pretty friendly. Even Raphael's insides were hyped, ready for a serious jolt to his system. Damien and the guards didn't interfere, but they noticed the mage had already caved to the prince's persuasion. For Tease, this was the perfect chance to show off his top-tier magic skills again. And to boost the mage's confidence, Raphael swore in front of the guards that if things went south, no one would execute Tease. But the guards didn't want to be tied to someone else's promises. So the prince let them in on a secret and admitted the whole plan was just to help one kid. Realizing the persuasion worked, the guy told the old man to hurry up and call down the lightning right now. The prince couldn't use lightning on Georg at the moment, so he told Tease to do a test strike on him instead. Raphael's heart activated a magic circle, and his whole body was flooded with Rahan energy. Wasting no time, Tease activated his staff and focused a burst of energy in his palm. The wizard sent a thin bolt of lightning straight into the prince's body and, to his surprise, managed to keep the voltage steady. The heir's heart sped up, processing new waves of power and shaping them into an electrode. If this works, Raphael will be able to transfer the electrode into the kid's body through his mana and calm the wandering nerve. The Rahan core technique is way too strong, so now the guy has to be even more careful with his power. The prince's body started shaking from the overload, and he asked the mage to stop generating lightning. After the experiment worked, the heir ordered everyone in the palace staff to gather in the guest bedroom. The maid, whose brother was sick, was really worried. After all, it was because of her that the prince decided to heal him in front of everyone. When the servants saw the high mage, they freaked out, thinking they were about to get experimented on too. But the prince was totally focused on the patient and pulled out his medical needle. With a couple of light jokes, Raphael distracted the kid from the pain and easily jabbed the tense nerve. The guy checked if the mage was ready, mentally bracing himself to heal the kid before the next attack hit. So, after giving Tiz the signal, he activated his mana to absorb the lightning energy. All the servants were stunned, and Pierrot straight up passed out when he saw his charge getting zapped. Grabbing a new needle, the prince charged it with mana and got ready to start the healing procedure. This time, getting into Georg's mana was easier, and Raphael immediately set off to look for the problem. Suddenly, sharp flashes started popping up in front of him. They weren't just nerves firing, but wild bursts of energy. Georg started shaking. The boy's body was so stressed it was about to go into another seizure. Raphael had to hurry. He only had a few minutes before the nervous system overloaded. Untangling the energy electrode, the guy reached the source of the inflammation and knew that's where he needed to hit with the current. But the prince realized that even with a big surge of energy, he wouldn't have time to drain the electrode completely. So he told the mage to crank up the lightning and not stop until the procedure was done. Raphael was definitely going to get a burn on his back, but right now every second counted. He couldn't just worry about himself. The mage combined all the magic stones in his staff, making the lightning turn yellow and way more powerful. Pain shot through the prince's body, but he used the last of his strength to spread out the tension. Finding the inflamed spot above the carotid artery, Raphael quickly started wrapping the nerve with a mana ribbon. There were only seconds left before another seizure, but just as the charge in the electrode ran out, it looked like the nerve was completely blocked. Georg's whole body seized up, foam bubbling at his lips and making it hard for him to breathe. The servants were terrified. They'd come to see the kid get healed, not tortured. Before the boy's nerves could totally overload, Raphael managed to pour all his mana right into the center of the vagus nerve. Suddenly, Georg's body stopped shaking and he woke up, even though he still looked scared. The prince realized he'd done it. It took everything he had, but he'd stopped the attack just in time. His sister watched in a panic. Usually, he'd pass out the moment the shaking started. Raphael pulled up his hologram, pumped that healing. Georg leveled up his doctor skills and earned him some extra days of life. The internal organs freaked out when a cocky newcomer showed up in their control center. The kid swaggered in, tossed his bag on the floor, and demanded someone unpack his stuff. He was here to stay. The organs had been waiting forever for some backup, so the stomach couldn't help itself and rushed over to hand out the junior badge. But before it could get there, the newbie slapped it away, insisting on some respect. He said he'd put everyone in their place if anyone else tried to look down on him. Raphael got a bunch of notifications. The system awarded him health points, and the liver was back online, joining the rest of the organs. Everything pointed to a successful treatment. The young patient was safe now. The prince praised the kid for being brave and checked how he was feeling, even though he looked pretty lively. Then he promised Georg that those sudden attacks would never happen again. The boy lit up with joy. He wanted to believe he was finally free from the demon and his family wouldn't be scared of him anymore. Everyone in the room witnessed the crown prince's promise. His sister couldn't hold back her tears. She wanted to believe all their family's troubles were finally over. So when Georg ran over and hugged her, she knew for sure he was completely healthy. The prince was feeling pretty proud of himself. His public marketing stunt totally paid off. The main gossips among his staff saw him heroically save the boy with their own eyes, so you can bet that story's about to spread like wildfire. He was already picturing the crowd lining up at his clinic after this, and how he'd rack up decades' worth of life energy. But that rush ended fast. His vision blurred, his body started to give out, and Damien and Pierrot rushed to catch him as he collapsed. Sure, his organs were happy to have a new teammate, but after that electric shock, his whole body was under serious stress. For a few days after the procedure, the prince was out cold, while his body tried to recover its strength. So when Raphael finally woke up late at night, the first thing he saw was the mage, Pierrot, and Damien keeping watch at his bedside. Pierrot, as usual, couldn't hold back his tears. He'd almost lost the prince so many times these past few months. Raphael also noticed how pale the mage looked, and realized the guy was already rehearsing his last words, just in case the emperor decided to execute him for zapping the air with lightning. But right now, none of that mattered. He was way more worried about Georg, who'd gone days without his care. Suddenly, a happy kid's face popped out from the crowd of servants, and he definitely didn't look sick anymore. The boy admitted he hadn't left the palace, insisting they let him wait until the prince got better. Now Georg felt a little awkward for being so stubborn, but he still wanted to give the doctor his gift. Raphael was stunned. The kid had made him a wooden medallion and waited all this time just to give it to him. Honestly, the boy shouldn't have been so impressed. Raphael was only acting out of self-interest, but the look in the kid's eyes broke something inside him. The guy who always did everything for himself had suddenly become a role model, inspiring people to be great too. That wooden pendant really touched him, and realizing he had loyal friends now gave him even more strength. Pierrot had been waiting for this for years. He believed his ward's heart would finally bring good back into the world, and a kid's gratitude was the best motivation. Raphael started coughing and asked everyone to leave so he could get back to sleep and let his body finish healing. As he left, Georg promised to visit his new friend tomorrow and help out with the next batch of patients at the clinic. After putting the pendant around his neck, the guy went back to sleep. Even though he was a prince with a treasury full of gold, it was that simple wooden charm that made him happiest right now. The suburbs of the capital were living their usual quiet life, at least until a bunch of staff from the small palace came home. One of the imperial waiters came back to his parents' place, making them happy and bragging that the prince had given everyone time off. Over family dinner, the guy shared the latest palace news and even boasted that some big changes were coming to his job soon. Then, lowering his voice, he admitted that the prince was getting better, but acting weird, and honestly, kind of freaking out the staff. Now the prince wanted to open a clinic in the small palace, and to prove it, the guy showed his parents the official announcement. The whole suburb started buzzing about the news from the mansion, and flyers for the new clinic popped up all over the streets. By evening, the prince's guards were out posting notices about free spots at the hospital for anyone who wanted them. Raphael spent a sleepless night waiting for his clinic's very first day. Pierrot could barely wait for morning, and as soon as he could, he barged into the prince's office, excited to kick off the clinic opening together. The two partners did a final walk-through of the small palace, making sure every room was ready for patients. But before they could get started, Pierrot finally worked up the nerve to ask again where his young boss had learned medicine. As a doctor, he was dying to know how the young prince had come up with an acupuncture technique that actually healed inflammation. You could tell Pierrot was really down about his own medical limits. He'd spent his whole life in this field. Raphael got it, so he decided to come clean. He told Pierrot he was from another world and let him decide whether to believe it or not. The guy even shared his real name, Lee Chonsak, and that he'd also devoted his whole life to studying medicine. But Pierrot just felt like his feelings were being mocked, even though it had taken a lot for him to open up. If the man wasn't ready to believe in something as wild as soul transmigration, Raphael wasn't about to push him. It was obvious the family doctor wanted to get better, and he promised to do everything he could to help the prince. The prince was tired of waiting, so he ordered Pierrot to watch his work and spend more time in the family library, where the secret archives were kept. Now that Raphael's got a loyal assistant with real healer experience, his clinic should be booming from day one. All morning, the guy was stressing that his old curse would catch up to him, even in this new life, and no patients would show up. Pulling himself together, the prince threw open the windows on the second floor and shouted a big welcome to everyone in the courtyard. But his voice just echoed through the empty garden. And right then, the reality of failure hit him hard. He was sure he was cursed. He hadn't felt this embarrassed in ages, so with shaky legs, he headed back to his office. But as soon as he went down to the first-floor hallway, he heard a crowd buzzing outside, all trying to get in. The Imperial guards were struggling to hold back the crowd in the yard, and Raphael was pumped. He finally had work to do. Patients were getting checked out fast, and the palace staff did their best to help the prince sort everyone out. Even though the staff had zero medical training, they kept distracting the prince from his work. After just a few hours, Raphael realized he'd have to run some training for the staff, or else they'd end up killing the patients. The young doctor used his body analysis skills so much that the hologram gave him a new ability. Now his own organs could analyze the patients. With a burst of mana, Raphael could link his own pro-level organ analysis to someone else's and figure out exactly what was wrong. The system actually worked, and the hologram diagnosed the patient with liver inflammation. He had to quit drinking. Raphael broke the bad news to the old man and told him he needed to change his habits. The patient was horrified. He'd been drinking his whole life, and now he was being told he'd die a terrible death if he didn't stop. The checkups went on all the way till evening, so the heir ordered only the really sick to stay overnight in the infirmary and told the rest to come back tomorrow. Even though his staff messed up a bunch of herbal brews, he was still super grateful for their help. Still, he needed to find some tough, no-nonsense nurses who could handle minor injuries on their own. Suddenly, the infirmary doors flew open and an anxious Pierrot showed up in the doorway, bringing some noblemen with him. The man had brought his unconscious mother and was begging the prince to save her life. The woman was burning up with a fever. The servants laid her down on the bed, but her body was so weak. Raphael started analyzing the situation while Dean explained how his mom had spent her day. Then, out of nowhere, the prince realized she was sick with the same fever that once wiped out an entire army in his world. The guy freaked out. This disease had destroyed Napoleon's empire back in the day, and now it had shown up in Magentano. Telling his son about typhus would just scare him even more, so he demanded to know everything about his mother's illness. The man was totally lost. Everything happened so fast, and after a warm bath, his mom just passed out. Raphael was deep in thought. Back in Napoleon's time, the disease spread because of poor hygiene among soldiers. But this lady always took good care of herself. Dean said his family had great servants, and their house was supposed to be totally safe from sickness. Then, suddenly, the man remembered. Just a few weeks ago, his mom visited some relatives and her carriage broke down on a farm road. So she spent the night in the farmer's guest room, but left their house first thing in the morning. Putting it all together, the prince was sure all the symptoms pointed to typhoid fever. Raphael told everyone that there are bugs that can spread the disease by biting and infecting the blood. They caught the illness late, and since the patient was already older, they needed something really strong to help her. There was no time to waste, so the prince ordered the servants to burn all her clothes and replace them with hospital garments. Then he told them to burn the bed and all the clothes of any servant who'd been in contact with her, or else there'd be no stopping an outbreak. Everyone just froze in terror and only snapped out of it when the master started shouting orders. They rushed to do what he said. Late that night, Raphael personally made a tonic for the woman, hoping it would bring her fever down. In the morning, the prince took care of the lady himself, trying to get her to drink the elixir. For the next couple of days, the servants helped look after her, but she still wouldn't wake up. In the end, her condition got even worse. The fever turned into pure agony. Raphael had no idea how to fix this. They'd done everything to care for the woman, but she was still slowly dying in his infirmary. Scanning her body one more time, he noticed her yin life energy was almost gone. That's why the medicine wasn't working. Suddenly, it hit him. He had to get to the main palace fast. He told Pierrot to get the carriage ready. There's a secret vault in the imperial palace where the world's rarest artifacts are kept. The heir's carriage raced toward the mansion. He'd have to convince his father to let him into the vault. It was late, and the emperor and his aide had just finished a meeting, so the heir's arrival caught them off guard. Raphael was used to his father's harsh ways, but right now the old man looked especially annoyed. Not wasting any time, the prince said he needed access to his father's secret vault to save a patient's life. He laid out all his suspicions and asked his father to trust him. Just let him look for a cure among the artifacts. But Taros didn't buy it. He thought his son was lying, just using pity as an excuse to get secret access. Still, Raphael could tell his father was actually enjoying this, making things harder on purpose. So, jumping to his feet, the heir snapped that he didn't have time for games while an innocent life was on the line. The emperor had spent his whole life seeing his son bedridden and sick. He just couldn't believe Raphael was now some kind of medical expert. He said an inexperienced kid could easily mess up the diagnosis, kill an aristocrat, and drag their family's name through the mud. Raphael realized this was a test. Ever since their duel, his father had been watching him like a hawk. The emperor pointed at his aide, Roberto, and said he had an illness no one knew about. If his son could name it, he'd get access. Raphael powered up his mana to scan Roberto's body, even though his father's intense stare was making him nervous. The old man was sure his son would fail. The aide's illness had a few secrets. But then the prince suddenly said the illness wasn't dangerous. Roberto was just losing his hair. That shocked everyone. Roberto panicked, while the emperor, sounding worried, insisted his aide still had all his hair. Suddenly, the guy yanked off the man's wig, showing off his shiny bald head, and said the test was a piece of cake. The assistant didn't want to be embarrassed in public, since he hadn't even managed to tell his wife about his secret yet. Leaving the others in the office, Raphael told Damien to follow him into a hidden hallway in the palace. The bodyguard thought the young master was being way too harsh with Roberto, but the guy promised he'd heal him after dealing with the epidemic. Now they had to search through the father's endless vault, but Raphael didn't even know what he was supposed to look for. In the throne room, Taras tried to calm his friend down, promising to give him a day off so he could go to the clinic and get treated by the prince. But before the happy prince could run into the secret vault, the imperial guards blocked his way. Raphael pulled out a temporary visitor pass and handed it to the guards, demanding they let them in before visiting hours ran out. But the guard warned him that if the crown prince tried to force his way into the vault, he'd get sliced up by magic beams. After checking the pass, the man said it was good until sunrise, which meant Raphael only had a couple of hours to search. Panicking, the guy rushed to the entrance, but the guards blocked his way again. They told him the pass only worked for the basic vault, and if they tried to get into the advanced one, the magic would fry them. The young master played dumb, complaining that he didn't know all the palace rules. At first, the Emperor only allowed access to the basic vault as a reward for passing the test, and even then, he could only take one item. The son wasn't happy with his father's stingy generosity, since he didn't even know what he was supposed to find. But Taros wouldn't budge, and no matter how much his son begged, he refused, and even threatened to take away his pass if he kept pushing. Raphael realized he'd been totally outplayed, and in the book, the Emperor was never described as such a tricky guy. So while they escorted the prince to the right room, he was fuming about how much work he had to do to fix his family relationships. He tapped the pass to the system, and the magic seals unlocked the entrance, starting the countdown. The guard said security would be waiting for visitors when they left the vault, so they'd better follow the rules. Raphael figured the room would be big, but he didn't expect to see rows and rows of cabinets packed with artifacts. The prince came up with a search system and told Damien to look for the item on the left side of the storage. Supposedly, there should be a blue artifact in the main storage that can generate cold. Handing his assistant a notebook, the boss told him to write down where any similar items were found. For almost an hour, the two of them checked every artifact, but the list of good candidates was pretty short. Apparently, because this was a low-level storage, most of the stuff here was anti-magic gear, and the prince wasn't a fan. When they finished searching, Damien led the boss to the very last row. Turns out, the mercenary had found an ancient shield that could create an ice barrier with mana. The prince picked up the artifact, tried to activate it with magic, and instantly felt a chill. But he didn't want to risk it and pour in all his power. Otherwise, they'd probably blow up half the storage. Controlling the shield wasn't too hard, but every time, the prince's weak body got hit by a wave of cold. He pushed in a bit more power, the mechanism kicked in, and a thin ice barrier formed in the air. Raphael was thrilled. If they could break the ice shield into pieces, he could use them to make a new potion. As soon as Damien opened the storage doors, guards rushed over to search him. One of the guards thought the mercenary's sword was stolen from the storage, but the prince's voice distracted him. After all, the prince was wearing a ton of jewelry he was trying to sneak out, but the guard stopped him. Pierrot had gone to bed early after a long day, but noise in the mansion's yard woke him up. He spotted the young master at the entrance with the mercenary and was surprised they were back so soon. Pierrot used to think the mercenary was a ruthless guy, but it looked like he'd managed to befriend the prince. So the healer made them some calming tea to help them get a good night's sleep. But when he came downstairs, he noticed the Lord was holding a really weird-looking shield. And Damien, who'd sworn to protect the heir, suddenly drew his sword and swung at the prince. Pierrot's heart clenched in terror. Just a second ago, he thought the bodyguard was a friend, but now he was a traitor. When Raphael and his partner got back from his father's palace, the guy wasn't in any rush to go to bed. Damien was blown away by the Lord's willpower and his drive to help the sick, so he was ready to do whatever he asked. But when the hyped-up prince asked the mercenary to hit him with his sword, the guy just froze. Sure, he was getting paid to protect the prince, not to beat him up in front of a courtyard full of guards. The mercenary's respect for the Lord took a hit, but he still swore it was all to save Lady Dior. On top of that, the prince was sure the shield's shards would save even more lives. But Damien wasn't a fan of this plan and started begging his partner to just set the artifact down and smash it. Thing is, Raphael had already figured out how it worked. It only activated in magical hands, so the merc had to break the shield without hurting him, or else his weak body would give out for good. Their plan was basically an attack on the air, so Damien said he wasn't doing it without getting paid. Looks like Raphael overestimated his bodyguard's honor. The guy in the book wasn't this money-hungry. Still, the merc said he believed in the Lord's good intentions, but a request like this could backfire if people got the wrong idea. The heir knew that by asking him to stay, he was giving his buddy a chance to pull his strings. After all, Damien had always been a loner since he was a kid, but his problems never came from being broke. And in the novel, the guy was a broke hero, so Raphael actually liked being able to change the main character's fates. So the prince couldn't help himself. He hugged his new friend and told him to hurry up and beat him before anyone saw. So when the merc landed the first heavy blow on the artifact, Pierrot ended up witnessing the whole fight. The guy blacked out in an instant. Lately, the prince had been acting reckless, but arresting a traitor was honestly the dumbest thing Pierrot had ever seen. Raphael managed to stay on his feet after the first hit, but the artifact was still intact. So Damien figured he needed to switch up his fighting style and go for a strike from the side. But when the mercenary saw the prince shaking with fear, he suggested coming up with a different plan. Still, on his boss's orders, he jumped and slammed the shield again, whipping up a powerful gust from the shockwave. After a dozen hits, each one Raphael promised to pay for, the prince was barely standing. Damien kept his cool. If he got a good bonus today, he could handle any rumors among the staff. But these pointless attacks had to stop, so the man told his boss to get into a solid stance. And this hit really was the last one, because the artifact shattered into tiny pieces of ice. Raphael was thrilled. Besides saving Lady Dior, he might even get to extend his own life. After picking up the shards, his partner headed back inside. But at the door, they spotted Pierrot, still knocked out cold. The next morning, a courier brought special herbs from the market, and Raphael whipped up another tonic for Lady Dior. By adding shards from the ice shield to the brew, the guy took the medicine to a whole new level. The system said her organs responded well to the new elixir, and it was safe for patients. The prince tossed more ice powder into the pot and headed for the infirmary. The patient's condition hadn't improved overnight, so the young master took her treatment into his own hands again. Lady Dior's son was really worried. He'd spent the whole night by his mother's bedside. So when the doctor came in, he begged for help, tears in his eyes, willing to try anything. After checking her over, Raphael saw her life force was at a dangerously low level. The guy hoped the ice elixir would work, so he fed it to the patient himself. This time, he didn't make any promises to the Dior family, so he just told the nobleman to head home and wait for news. For the whole next week, Raphael took care of the patient himself, prepping supplies and pulling all-nighters. And after almost 2 weeks, the staff at the small palace started spreading rumors. Pierrot, like everyone else, noticed the changes in the crown prince, and it made people respect him even more. But behind that doctor's mask, Raphael was just annoyed, running on zero sleep and totally wearing himself out. The only thing keeping him going was the motivation to rack up more bonus days of life for saving people. The hologram let him know that thanks to public approval, Raphael was getting a bigger reward, and that news gave the prince a real boost. A few days later, Lady Dior made a full recovery, and the prince decided to personally see her home. The imperial carriage headed out to the suburbs while Lady Dior's son kept thanking the prince nonstop. After dropping the nobles off at their estate, Raphael reminded them to come back for a follow-up visit. Like a true gentleman, Raphael turned down the money and told his new friends that his clinic always puts patients first. Everyone there teared up at the future ruler's honest words and promised to spread the word about his care. But before the nobles went back inside, Raphael asked Dean to join him for a quick trip. The man got nervous. If the prince didn't want money, he must need a favor. But the Dior family wasn't all that influential. The coachman sat his passenger up front and steered the carriage toward the city market. Raphael didn't want to get too close to patients' families. He didn't want to be responsible for every illness they'd ever have. The prince waited for them to offer him gifts. But when that didn't happen, he started complaining about how exhausted he was at the clinic. Then he made a show of coughing, hinting that he'd lost sleep taking care of Lady Dior. Finally, Dean felt bad for staying quiet and said he'd do anything the prince asked. After all, his mother's life was worth more than any gift. Raphael kept refusing the money. If people thought he charged for his services, no one would come to him. Then, out of nowhere, he pulled out a dossier on the Dior family and said he knew all the nobles' professions and wanted Dean, as an artist, to help him with his exhibition. A crowd of townsfolk gathered at the city market square, and besides shopping, they were all ears for the latest gossip. One of the merchants dug up some juicy news from the small palace for his assistant. The man said his assistant needed to get a job at the prince's clinic to pay rent for his room. The old man threatened to kick the slacker out if he missed another chance to pay off his debts. Rumors about hiring new workers were the talk of the town, but one shopper got suspicious about it all. At the Fonrier Art Gallery, Dean Dior's exhibition opened, drawing in a ton of locals. For the first time anyone could remember, an aristocrat's paintings were the talk of regular folks. Raphael was thrilled. His memory-packed brain started throwing out awesome ideas for the artist. That's why Dean painted the Crown Prince as a president, reaching out and calling people to join him. The guy even convinced Damien and Pierrot to pose for a group portrait, showing off their life at the estate. Even though Damien didn't like a lot of the artist's work, thinking it was twisted and made the prince look weak. But Raphael reassured his artist, promising him fame if he kept painting bold pieces. Still, the main attraction was a massive canvas showing nurses and the prince as a doctor, announcing recruitment for a medical school. Sure, nobody in town really got what the slogans on the paintings meant, but they were drawn in by the whole mysterious vibe. The creative exhibition was a huge hit. Almost everyone who came filled out a job application. Flyers with pay details spread through the crowd, and a lot of people were in tears, dreaming of a brighter future. The market shopper came to the exhibition too, but when she found out only city residents could get hired, she got super mad. The flood of applicants made the prince ecstatic. If everything went to plan, the clinic would finally take off. Of course, out of all those applications, only a few people would actually know anything about medicine, so the selection process was going to be tough. The prince was so happy, he actually started singing in front of everyone. People might call him a messiah, but if lying to them helps him live longer, he's totally fine with that. Every day, Damien was more and more convinced. The air really was something else. A week later, a crowd of candidates for the medical staff gathered at the gates of the small palace. On top of that, even the lady from the market made it to the presentation. She managed to get her city resident card just in time. The event host shouted at the top of his lungs that the staff selection was starting, and announced the prince would give the first task in a week. Just as expected, fewer people showed up a week later than the first time, which meant only the most determined candidates were left. But when the host said they'd have to run a cross-country race through the imperial gardens and complete some tasks, people started to freak out. The guards swung open the main gates, split everyone into small groups, and reminded them only 10 people would make it through. In a panic, the first group took off running, and in the chaos, they almost trampled each other. When the first 10 crossed the finish line, Piero disqualified anyone who was late. But he didn't let them rest. He immediately announced the second test, analyzing medicinal herbs. The candidates started checking the roots, trying to spot the spoiled ones. Suddenly, one of the contestants collapsed with loud, ragged breaths, totally unconscious. Raphael was shocked that nobody paid any attention to the poor guy. They all just kept working on the task. Signaling to Piero to stop the test, the prince decided right then. None of the first group was moving on. The doctor politely escorted the group out of the garden, promising to announce the results soon. And even stopping the test didn't make anyone want to help the poisoned stranger. Once the garden was clear, Raphael asked Damien to quit pretending to be dead. The mercenary was just glad his acting skills were good enough to fool the crowd. But the prince wasn't impressed. He was worried that someone getting poisoned would scare off the rest of the candidates and make them quit. So for the next groups, Raphael told his bodyguard to really ham it up, scream like crazy and faint dramatically. Piero was seriously impressed by the prince's acting skills, even promising him a spot in the theater if he ever wanted it. But thanks to Damien's first fake-out, the boss was sure that no one from the first group would ever work for him. The mercenary was honestly shocked that an heir so good with people actually cared more about the candidates' personalities than their medical knowledge. Just like he expected, none of the other groups reacted at all when a stranger collapsed in front of them. By the end of tryouts, Raphael was almost desperate. None of these future medics seemed to care about a sick person. Trying to shake off his frustration, the prince went to check if there were any candidates left. But the gate was empty, which just pissed Raphael off even more. Now he couldn't expand his clinic. Suddenly, he noticed one of the guards arguing with a stranger, refusing to let her take the test. The girl kept insisting she was a city resident and had every right to try out. Raphael was shocked at how careless his guards were, especially since they were already short on staff. But when Damien said the stranger was a shapeshifter, the prince was caught off guard. There wasn't much known about shapeshifters from the novels, except that they were born with super tough bodies, and their natural instincts could sense the exact dosage for all kinds of medicine, which made them perfect for a nurse's job, exactly what Raphael needed. Still, the guard didn't want to let a shapeshifter into the manor, even threatening to call for backup. The prince rushed to the gate and managed to stop a fight from breaking out, telling everyone to calm down. Raphael was also pissed that the guards broke his promise and kept city residents from applying for the job. Wanting to be fair, he demanded the guard apologize to the stranger. The girl appreciated the gesture and introduced herself as a niece, daughter of a regional clan leader. Since everyone was cool with it, Raphael announced he'd let the girl take the trials right now, and he didn't care that she was a shapeshifter. The boss set a condition. Since there were no other contestants left, the guard would have to race against her. Then he pointed to the fountain in the middle of the yard and said, "Whoever gets back here first wins." That fired up Annis's competitive side. She tossed her cloak aside and said she was ready to race. To keep things fair, the guard took off his heavy armor and got ready to run. Wasting no time, Raphael waved the flag and kicked off the first challenge. In just a few seconds, the girl shot ahead. She wasn't even running, more like leaping huge distances. The prince was blown away. None of the other candidates had ever been that fast. Her shapeshifter agility was insane, especially when she grabbed the top of the fountain and spun around to head back. The two racers met halfway, just as Annis was about to cross the finish line. The guard didn't want to lose, so he tried to speed up and ended up twisting his ankle. He crashed hard, and when he finally stopped rolling, his yell echoed through the garden. Annis was sure she'd win, but when she saw her injured rival, she got annoyed. Even from a distance, she could tell he'd dislocated his shoulder, so she slammed on the brakes and ran over to help. She grabbed his arm and with a quick move popped his shoulder back into place. Anis wanted to win by a mile, but her natural kindness got the better of her. Raphael was amazed at how fast she reacted, and right away said he was hiring the shapeshifter. By evening, the prince's office already had all the paperwork ready for her new job. The girl looked over the contract and noticed there were a ton of rules about being a nurse. Raphael's teammates were surprised their boss was such a smooth negotiator and acted like a polite old man. But the prince was sure he'd found real treasure, because besides being tough, Anis was also smart. The only downside? The girl had a fiery temper. She literally popped her rival's shoulder back in place, and not gently. That cracked the prince up. They'd be dealing with all kinds of patients, and if Anis got rough with them, it'd be bad for business. As soon as she finished reading the contract, Raphael rushed to get her to sign it. But suddenly, the werewolf girl set a condition. She'd only take the job if the prince granted her request. Raphael wasn't ready to negotiate. He'd already offered a pretty generous salary. But the second he heard she was the head of an entire clan, he was willing to agree to anything. He needed top-notch staff for his clinic, even if that meant hiring 50 hot-headed wolves. The prince started massaging Anis's neck, nodding along to her ideas for jobs for her clan. But the whole pack would only work for the prince if he could break their ancient curse. Embarrassed, the girl admitted her people were always in danger because of their tails. Just like animals, their tails moved on their own. Still, from her story, Raphael couldn't figure out what exactly was wrong with their tails. Turns out, you could easily read a werewolf's emotions just by looking at their tail. And because of that, a lot of werewolves get scammed, which really worries her as clan leader. Anis admitted it's almost impossible to control their tails, and even if you cut one off, it just grows back. Only then did the prince get what they wanted from him. He was just a doctor, not some genetic scientist. The responsibility was huge, so he suggested protecting the werewolves in society instead. With his imperial title, he could make Anis's clan untouchable. But the girl immediately turned him down, because that wouldn't actually make their lives any better. As the head of her clan, she's not here for some quick fix. Aristocrats' promises never last. If the price of success is someone else's tail, then Raphael's got a big decision to make. For a second, Anis was actually happy someone wanted to help her, until her tail started twitching under her pants. To her surprise, the prince turned out to be super honest and didn't rush to promise he'd fix everything. The girl said she'd stay at the palace for a few days, at least until the prince made up his mind. But when he was alone with his crew, the prince couldn't hold back his cries of despair. He wasn't getting the best nurses after all. In a full-on tantrum, the guy started rolling around on the couch, totally clueless about how to paralyze someone's tail. The prince spent the whole night in the family library, trying to figure out werewolf anatomy. The young lord almost tumbled down the stairs when the doctor suddenly popped up in the library. Pierrot was worried about his patient. If the prince kept stressing out like this, he could end up in a coma again. But Raphael was pretty sure his heart would give out first if his assistant kept scaring him like that. That's why the man felt kinda awkward about freaking out so much. Honestly, the prince had been healthier than ever these last couple months. Ever since his reincarnation, the prince had gotten used to the doctor's weird habits and actually thought he was a good guy. The guys traded a few lines, and the prince loved messing with the doctor using random made-up terms. When suddenly, he had a light bulb moment. Werewolf tails move on their own and have nerves. If he could get his hands on botulotoxin, he could totally paralyze that part. But right now, he's living in medieval times, and the only person he'd seen with something that strong was Kuzman, who somehow got a hold of it. After a successful raid on the underground arenas, Pierrot had kept a sample of the slave owner's poison. Raphael was sure this would solve Anis's problem, and if it didn't kill her, it'd at least paralyze her tail. Being in a new place gave the werewolf insomnia, so the girl decided to work out. When someone knocked on her bedroom door, she definitely wasn't expecting it to be the prince, who looked super hyped. Without wasting a second, the guy grabbed the girl and led her straight to the exam room. Raphael had read a ton of books, but he needed to scan the werewolf's body himself to figure out where the tail nerve was. Using a mana scan, the prince saw that the werewolf's body was perfectly healthy, but its nervous system was totally different. On one hand, Anis looked human, but Raphael insisted she transform into a wolf. Her clan had learned to avoid turning during the full moon ages ago, but she was still a bit hesitant. Calming her nerves, she used a light transformation and her body shifted fully into wolf form. The prince expected more, but he wasn't scared of Anis, even though he thought werewolves would be huge. The transformation also brought back memories of when Chansak had a dog, But Anis's angry growl made things way more serious. Still, Raphael couldn't help joking around and asked Anis to give him her paw so he could scan her wolf body. But things got out of hand when the prince started giving commands and the girl, like an obedient pup, began rolling over. Piero knew his ward had missed out on simple joys as a kid, so seeing him act playful made the healer happy. After checking out the werewolf, Raphael was even more puzzled by the problem. The poison taken from Kuzman was still a mystery, so the heir had no idea what dose to give Anis. The easiest way to get all the answers would be to sneak into the slaver's prison, but that guy could easily trick everyone. For a second, the prince thought about taking a pill himself and analyzing it through Rahan's energy. But then his internal organs called an emergency meeting and pushed that idea right out of his head. Plus, his liver was furious. Detoxing would be its job, and honestly, it'd be way easier just to summon a monster. A hologram popped up with advice to test the poison on a monster, but he really didn't want to poison a hedgehog. On top of that, his organs were pissed that someone was trying to kill them again after all that tough healing. So, the system came up with a genius idea. Summon a monster that could analyze the ingredients. Raphael started checking out the hologram's tips, trying to match them up with his health points. The liver admitted there's a waiting room in the system, where all the organs hang out before they get restored. But whenever he tried to see the inactive creatures, the system just refused to cooperate. So Raphael tried to convince the liver to give him a detailed rundown on the analysis monster. The other organs were loving the chaos. They'd suffered way too much from their host's experiments. A revolt wouldn't help right now, so the prince started threatening his own body with punishment. But the protest kept going, so the guy decided to hold his breath to freak the organs out. The laughter turned to panic, especially the lungs, who really weren't into this and started begging for mercy. After a couple seconds, the liver started spilling all the details about the waiting room, hoping the lungs would start working again. The room lit up with a bright flash, and suddenly a yellow fish appeared right in the prince's hands. The sun monster was actually pretty cute, and it could fly too, so Raphael felt kinda guilty about wanting to poison it. But there wasn't much time. The tail surgery was tomorrow, so he had to test the monster's skills fast. While he prepped the poison vials, the hedgehog and the fish became buddies and started playing together. So, disguising the pill as food, the host fed it to the fish, hoping to see what would happen. The hologram popped up, letting him know the body now thought its owner was heartless after that trick. The second the fish tasted the elixir, its whole body froze up instantly. The hedgehog was horrified. His friend had just been ruthlessly killed, and he figured he might be next. But the analysis skills kicked in. The fish came back to life right away and started jotting down the poison's ingredients. Raphael was blown away by the insane new skills. With this monster, he could totally save his clinic. All that was left was to finish prepping, and as soon as he called for Pierrot, the healer came running out from behind the curtain. And once again, the prince lied about animals just being drawn to him, even though that flying fish was clearly weird as hell. But Pierrot knew full well his ward was special, someone who could actually summon helpers. The man told a story about a legendary architect named Fonrier, who had a bunch of monuments in the empire named after him. According to the old records, this genius had 5 summoned creatures, which meant Raphael could probably summon just as many. Still, there was no time to get distracted, so the prince ordered the infirmary to be prepped and told them to bring Anis in for surgery. Unlike the prince, Pierrot was super anxious. He didn't even know all the steps of the operation. He also noticed how nervous Anis was, but tried to convince her that the young master knew exactly what he was doing. The girl had lived her whole life with a tail, always hiding it under baggy pants, so yeah, she was a bit freaked out. Before heading into the procedure room, the doctor asked her to stay calm and not be scared of the prince's weird treatment methods. The man opened the infirmary doors and promised he'd stay by her side the whole time. Raphael hadn't slept a wink all night, but honestly, the thought of trying a new surgery had him pumped. He gathered up a crowd of servants again. Guaranteed, they'd spread rumors about his cutting-edge treatment all over town. Of course, Anis didn't buy it and demanded he explain the whole procedure first. In his usual carefree way, the heir pulled out some needles and announced he'd be poking the werewolf's tail with them. Then he brought out a set of poison vials and promised to use them to paralyze the tail for good. The servants, his audience, burst into applause at their master's creative solution. But Anis was horrified. It really looked like they were about to torture her in front of a bunch of nosy onlookers. Still, when she glanced at Pierrot, she saw the man actually trusted the prince and was giving her a look like, "Relax." Even the servants asked the wolf girl to trust their future ruler. After all, he'd already worked plenty of miracles. Waving the needles and poison around, Raphael suggested they get started so he could finally get some sleep. After the Lord's creepy smile, the girl totally freaked out. She was definitely stuck in a madhouse where everyone just spoils the crown prince. The prince used some trance technique to calm down the werewolf and for now set the needles aside. His patience only lasted a second, though. He grabbed the needles again and showed the staff his treatment was about to be a medical breakthrough. There was still time to back out of the surgery, but Annis reminded herself about her clan and their future. The servants brought in a special shirt with a hole just for her tail. With the maid's help, they got the girl onto the operating table, and just by looking at her tail, you could tell she was scared. Raphael scrubbed his hands and told all his assistants to step away from the table. After Georg was miraculously saved, a lot of the servants basically worshipped the prince and wanted to learn medicine too. The prince powered up his Rahan energy, spreading his mana over his heart. At first glance, Annis's whole nervous system looked totally fine. Following the nerve signals, Raphael reached the animal core of her body. He paused the energy flow with a needle and rerouted the wolf power in a loop. Suddenly, her tail sprang to life, wagging all on its own, even though Anis was definitely not feeling happy right now. The first shot was a miss, so the doctor amped up his mana and kept exploring her body. The energy led him to a tiny spot on her neck, and when he pressed it, her tail finally calmed down. The silence in the room broke with the prince's excited shout. He was sure he'd nailed it. Annis sat up in bed, trying to get used to the new feeling, but her tail wouldn't budge. It seemed like all the servants were waiting for her verdict, since now her tail didn't give away her real emotions. Raphael got tired of the awkward silence, so, channeling Pierrot, he introduced everyone to the tailless werewolf. The next second, Annis burst into tears. The centuries-old struggle with her tail was finally over. The prince appreciated her tears, but let her know that even though her tail wasn't moving anymore, now her pinky toe would wiggle instead. And since nobody died during the surgery, it was the perfect time to sign a contract for the medical staff. Anis remembered the deal perfectly, but the prince's excitement felt more like a street vendor than a nobleman. In the end, the deal went through, and the prince's clinic got a whole clan of shapeshifters on board. Pierrot respected how responsible the new hires were, though he did tell the prince he was worried about the wolves' hot tempers. But that didn't really matter, since every patient got care on time and the chance of mixing up meds dropped to zero. Raphael didn't get any extra days to live for healing the shapeshifters, but he did level up his analysis skill. Over the past couple of days, the prince ran some nurse training courses, so now they could handle basic diagnoses. Meanwhile, brewing healing potions in the kitchen turned into a non-stop routine. But with so many workers around, Raphael lost his shot at treating simple illnesses, which meant he needed another terminally ill patient to score a life bonus. After all, his shapeshifters could work around the clock, taking care of patients just like the boss ordered. Either way, the heir was pretty pleased with himself. At least in this life, he managed to get a business running. During all this steady work, his internal organ system announced that the spleen had finally woken up. But its recovery came with a sudden hunger and the urge to eat everything in the palace. Raphael freaked out over the flood of notifications, since it was the first time his body ever felt hungry and needed extra energy. The new organ would give him more health points, but its cravings were for food you couldn't even find in the Empire. He tricked his hunger with a handful of candy, deciding to deal with the system later. With the new guy on board, the other organs were just glad they'd finally get real food instead of drinking potions every day. As soon as the spleen got the vitamins it needed from the sweets, the hologram let him know his mana level had gone up. And the very next second, the prince felt a sharp pain in his chest, and a second Rahan branch formed around his heart. The risk of him passing out is finally down, so now the heir can actually help the werewolves. After giving out a few tips, the guy headed to the infirmary to double-check the diagnoses. The junior treasurer was, as usual, busy checking the expenses of the small palace. But when the man calculated the clinic's potential costs, he was horrified. If they keep spending on staff and treating people for free, the prince is gonna go broke. With that bad news, the treasurer burst into the heir's office, catching everyone off guard. Raphael and his team were planning to expand the infirmary when their meeting got interrupted. The guy had no idea he even had a personal accountant running his finances. Mr. Martin, freaking out, said they're headed for a financial crisis if the clinic keeps working for free. On top of that, at the start of the year, the prince himself cut the estate's benefits, thinking he'd die soon anyway. That news just crushed Raphael. Even bankruptcy seems to be haunting him everywhere. Martin admitted they're paying the werewolves way too much, so maybe it's time to cut the staff. But that set the prince off. He'd worked way too hard to get such valuable people on his team. So the guy started pushing the treasurer to find some other useless palace expenses to cut instead. After all, they work for the crown prince. Shouldn't the emperor be funding them properly? But then Martin dropped another bomb. By order of the ruler, the small palace can only raise its budget next year. The prince was devastated. He was about ready to cry like a kid if debt collectors showed up here too. Collapsing to the floor, he figured he must be a terrible businessman if even millions can't save him. Right now, his father doesn't believe in the clinic, and to get funding, he needs real results. Just a few months ago, the crown prince of the empire was a sickly wreck. They'd already dug his grave. If he gives up again, he'll just prove his dad right, so he's gotta find the money. Martin worked out a payment plan, but even after cutting back on basics, the clinic's cash will run out by the end of summer. The only way out he saw was getting the emperor's blessing to raise his son's salary. Raphael decided to go for it and headed to his dad with a rundown of his medical achievements. A couple of hours later, the prince came back. His father refused to help and kicked him out of the main mansion. The guy was pissed. He'd scored a golden ticket to reincarnation, but thanks to his old man's grudges, he was about to die broke again. But then a tip from Chonsok's student days popped into his head. Back then, the future doc used to pawn all kinds of stuff. The prince ordered the treasurer to make a list of all the luxury items. They were going to sell them off. By the end of the week, a bunch of paintings and priceless artifacts had ended up in aristocrats' homes, and Martin was seriously bummed out. He couldn't believe the emperor's heir just ditched the family luxury so easily, and the guy was ready to head back to the main palace. The next morning, Raphael got a thin report from the finance guy. Still not enough money. So the young lord decided the medical clinic had to start making some cash. That announcement bummed out all the staff since everyone knew treatment was free. But the prince had it all figured out. They'd keep treating people for free, but open a pharmacy at the palace to sell remedies. Damien was floored by his lord's creativity. Even in tough times, he still cared about the poor getting treatment. But Raphael was also super calculating. He wanted to invent a special remedy the rich would want to buy. Rumors started spreading again in the marketplace about the shaky state of the small palace. But regular folks admired the future ruler's determination. He was so compassionate toward the poor. The rumors turned into real trust in the prince, and people even started calling him a holy healer. But right now, Raphael's days were pretty dark. There weren't more patients, and his clinic was still losing money. Mr. Martin did everything he could to help the heir out, even went as far as making some early price estimates for the goods. But he still kept trying to convince the young master to charge the nobles for doctor visits. All those ideas got shot down right away, though. According to the system, the prince only had 6 months left to live, and he needed to find people with serious illnesses. In Korea, pharmaceutical companies made good money off vitamins and supplements, so Raphael figured he should bring that to Magentano too. And since the local nobles loved getting their hands on rare stuff, he could launch a miracle pill under the emperor's brand. The prince was so hyped about his idea, he was ready to spend his last bit of cash to make it happen. After all, they'd need to get their hands on Minotaur saliva, the rarest creature on the whole continent. Korea had already come up with a pure mind pill ages ago, made from a special blend of herbs. Every Korean had this powerful medicine. It helped calm your nerves, strengthen your heart, and boost your immune system. If Raphael could recreate it in this new world, it would blow up the market. That's why the prince told Damien they had to find a live Minotaur to make the magic pill even stronger. The Minotaur would be the perfect marketing hook for rich folks who were always chasing after rare stuff. So for these greedy types, Raphael was ready to sell each pill for a crazy high price. Damien was sometimes surprised by how greedy the prince could get, but he never crossed the line. Even though he'd never heard of these kinds of remedies before, he wanted to believe they'd work. So the prince lied and said the recipe for the miracle cure came to him in a dream, and that he was basically a genius from the modern world. To really sell it, he told the mercenary all kinds of stories about his dreams and how he'd saved people's lives with needles. Sir Pierrot was super gullible and totally bought into the prince's wild stories. But Damien saw the bigger picture. As long as he was getting paid well, he'd play along with whatever the prince wanted. Still, the mercenary didn't get why someone as powerful as the prince wanted to heal people without an official license. That statement really freaked Raphael out. He'd gotten so caught up in his own genius, he totally forgot about the law. Every doctor in the empire has a license, but they spend years learning at the academy, so dreams don't really count as training. First things first, they had to figure out the money. No one at the local market sold Minotaur goods, so you couldn't just buy it. So the only way to get this rare ingredient was to actually buy a Minotaur. There's a coastal city in the empire called Cremo, famous for its auctions and black market trading. Raphael decided to go there himself. Now that his body was stronger, he wanted to see his own lands. Damien was already doubting his master's sanity. The trip was long, and the guy could drop dead any minute. After an hour, the prince's carriage was ready, and a few private security coaches were waiting for orders. Raphael had to leave the palace before Pierrot found out about their trip. As soon as the prince's carriage rolled out, the doctor started yelling in the courtyard, doing everything he could to catch up. Before leaving, the heir told the doctor to keep an eye on the clinic and not blow the last of their money. The carriage ride was comfy for Damien, but he just couldn't get used to sleeping in coffins. 8 days straight through the Magentano forests finally paid off. The carriage made it to Cremo. At sunset, the port was buzzing. Ships were unloading goods, and merchants were getting permits to trade. Plus, the prince noticed double-masted family ships, which meant foreign diplomats were in town. Raphael was pumped. Since his rebirth, he hadn't left the palace, and now he was surrounded by all these exotic people. The Cremo Monster auction house was right in the city center, and judging by all the carriages out front, they'd just brought in new beasts. The driver stopped right at the entrance, but a local mercenary told the strangers to get off the square. But the second the crown prince showed up, rumors about his visit started flying among the merchants. The city mayor, surrounded by guards, was getting ready for the evening auction to start. Suddenly, a terrified guard ran up to him, blurting out that the emperor's eldest son had arrived. The heir showing up in such a remote place instantly sent the whole town into a panic. Mayor Cremo figured they were here for him. After all, business hadn't been great lately. Trying to break the tension, he rushed over to the heir himself to find out why he'd come. But Raphael kept things vague, just hinting that he wanted to check out the auction. To keep an eye on the prince, the mayor assigned a few guards to protect him. But the prince just pointed at his gang of mercenaries and werewolves, warning everyone not to mess with his evening plans. And to calm the jittery nobles, the heir promised he'd leave the port right after the beast exhibition. With barely any time left before the auction, Raphael headed straight to the hall without waiting for Cremo's invite. Behind him, the mayor started barking orders at the guards, telling them to step up patrols like it was a top priority. In the main hall of the beast house, it was dead silent. Nobody wanted to wake the monsters in their cages. Lots of aristocrats had brought serious cash and weren't shy about placing big bets. The prince was blown away. He'd never seen magical creatures before, but Raphael noticed the whole event felt pretty dull, probably because the animals were always the same at every show. The auctioneer signaled the sale of an anaconda to the lady in black, and then the guards brought out a new cage. The bidding went on, but there was still no sign of the Minotaur, even though it had been hyped up at the port. After a few more monsters were sold, suddenly he appeared, a massive bull with razor-sharp horns. The creature let out a wild roar and tried to break out of its cage, scaring the spoiled aristocrats half to death. The monster was absolutely huge, and Raphael had no idea how anyone could even take it home. The crowd started clapping as the auctioneer rattled off the bull's impressive stats. The prince scanned the beast from a distance. It was in a pretty savage state, but the tranquilizers were keeping it under control. Raphael was sure this Minotaur was the key to making his magic pill truly healing. Plus, he was already imagining how many pills he could make from just one monster, enough to cover the clinic's expenses for a whole year. The host hyped up the crowd's greed with wild stories about how hard it was to catch the creature, then kicked off the bidding at 50,000 coins. The young lord's mood tanked. Previous lots had gone for way less. Damien noticed the prince's disappointment, but the mercenary knew for sure they'd brought plenty of cash. The nobles in the lower rows started shouting out their bids. Monsters this big don't show up every day. If Raphael blew all 100,000 at the auction, it'd wreck the clinic's budget, so he'd have to find another way to get the Minotaur. If he were in Korea, that kind of money would buy him a penthouse downtown. Here, it'd just get him a bull. The prince's brain was racing for ideas, but with the whole place under heavy guard, there was no way to steal the goods right now. Then suddenly, it hit him. He could use all of Damien's shady skills. The mercenary had hoped to leave his old life behind, but if the boss himself was giving the order, he'd have to go through with it. Raphael had always wanted to break the rules. Being part of the imperial family meant he was supposed to uphold the law. Arguments over the price broke out near the stage, and while the crowd was distracted, Damien slipped into the shadows. The host announced they'd be bidding on the Minotaur all evening, so the guests should take their time thinking about their offers. The prince started to panic. The price had jumped by several thousand, and there was still no sign of Damien. Then suddenly, the happy voice of the mayor rang out behind him. He'd shown up with the mercenary in tow. From the very first meeting, the young lord had sensed something off about dealing with Cremo, but it seemed like he was about to propose a deal. Sir Cremo had built his whole political career on his sharp mind and knowing exactly what people wanted. So the man figured the prince wanted some public attention and loudly announced that 100 guards were ready to protect the heir. By order of the mayor, a whole line of bodyguards lined up behind the boss, which totally impressed the regular aristocrats. Of course, if the buyers found out about the prince, they'd back off from the monster, so Raphael appreciated Cremo's help. But for Damien, all this political small talk was new, and he really didn't care to get into it. And while everyone was distracted from the bidding, the heir wrote his price on the board, bumping it up by 10,000. With such a huge jump, hardly anyone could keep up, so most of the nobles dropped out. The auctioneer started to panic. If the lot sold for 60,000, catching the Minotaur would actually lose money. The monster let out another angry roar across the hall, almost like it wanted everyone to notice it was up for sale. Suddenly, a paddle shot up in the middle of the room with a new bid, beating the prince's offer by 10,000. The auctioneer locked onto the new bidder. If he played the crowd right, maybe he could push the price all the way to 100,000 coins. Desham was the envoy of a southern tycoon, and his appearance at the auction was a total sensation. Raphael was furious. Now his gangster plan was ruined, since Desham wasn't even a citizen of the empire. A bunch of spectators started cheering for the envoy. Apparently, everyone knew the crown prince wasn't exactly best friend material. Up in the imperial balcony, the young lord was getting more and more fired up, since he could hear every aristocrat whispering. There was a clear challenge in Desham's eyes, so the prince started aggressively raising his bids for the monster. For the next half hour, the two bidders kept upping the price by 1,000 coins each time, which really started to annoy the regular buyers. Finally, the auctioneer announced the Minotaur was sold for 500,000 coins to Mr. Desham. The envoy was super pleased with himself. It was the first time someone from the top ranks had managed to put the stuck-up prince in his place. Meanwhile, the heir just sat there in gloomy silence. He'd always thought he had more money than anyone else in the empire. With tears in his eyes, he watched the Minotaur's cage leave the stage. Honestly, Damien was glad they lost the auction. Now he wouldn't have to sabotage the whole event. The prince actually felt kinda good that his mercenary cared about the clinic's finances. But honestly, what really bothered the guy was that he and his crew might not get the monthly pay their boss promised. Turns out, Raphael had created a capitalist monster who'd never even heard of words like honor or loyalty. Apparently, saving a mercenary from a slaver doesn't count as a lifelong bond, but hey, the prince still had time to fix that. In the novel's story, Damien is the strongest and most reliable hero, so as long as he's guarding the prince, everything's fine. But for the future to stay safe, the mercenary needs to tie most of his life to the prince. So for now, he's promised steady pay. The auction wrapped up and the mayor offered to let the heir stay at his mansion before heading to the capital, but the prince had already slipped out. Desham was riding high on victory, and the cowardly escape of the older heir made it even sweeter. After the purchase, the Minotaur was taken to the basement of the southern embassy and chained up with enchanted shackles. The envoy had never gotten his hands on such a rare trophy before, so he decided to turn it into an incredible display. Behind the man, metal tools clanged, sending chills down the monster's spine. For this, Desham had brought in a unique craftsman from the southern lands, the same guy who made trophies for the royal family. But the taxidermist wasn't here for the art. He'd get a fat payout for working on the Minotaur and a ticket out of the empire. The envoy wanted the trophy to be the centerpiece of his collection, which meant the monster had to look seriously majestic. To make the project perfect, the man even found a mage who could put the beast to sleep without hurting it too much. Truth is, the wizard was actually a warlock who did side jobs on the magical black market. The Minotaur was already weak after days locked up and heavy tranquilizers. The wizard summoned a void sphere to knock out the monster without leaving any marks. But as soon as the energy orb hit the beast, the ground shook and the Minotaur went berserk in an instant. The Minotaur's mind flashed back to when he was happy, living with his family in the mountain meadows. But then the royal guards showed up, killed his whole family, and trapped him. For weeks, they kept him locked in a tiny cage, drugged him to sleep, and barely fed him. The Minotaur's rage took over his mind, and a sudden burst of strength let him rip the chains right out of the ground. The energy field vanished, and the wizard's spell failed to put the beast to sleep. Now he was out for blood and ready to tear the whole city apart. The week-long journey had drained Raphael, and chances were he'd get sick again once he got home. Plus, his body, and even his organs, started rebelling against the crazy schedule. Losing the auction was still eating at the prince, and he was dead set on getting the Minotaur tomorrow. Suddenly, the guards burst into the heir's chambers, shouting for everyone to get out of the mansion right now. The guards were freaking out, but Damien told his master to listen to him and no one else. The group barely made it out of the bedroom before a thunderous crash shook the mansion and chunks of stone went flying. Damien managed to shield the prince from getting hurt, but the monster's roar made the mercenary draw his sword. In the next instant, the bodyguard was sent flying, not even fast enough to dodge the Minotaur's fist. All the guards were down for the count, and now the prince was left alone to face the beast's fury. The savage roar echoed through the whole estate, but Raphael immediately noticed something different in the monster's eyes. The guy was sure someone had filled the Minotaur with rage, and he was the one who could stop him. The southern embassy was wrecked after the energy surge and the beast's rampage. Everyone in the building's basement got crushed by the falling stones. But Desham was a coward, and luckily for him, he managed to hide by the wall. The Minotaur wanted revenge on everyone who locked him up and took his family, so the animal dealer was first on his list. The creature raised its massive fist and slammed it into the ground, just inches from the envoy. Desham was sprinting through the suburbs, trying to get away from the pissed-off monster. The loud noises started waking people up, but no one dared to step outside. The messenger figured if he could make it to the mayor's place, the local guards would protect him. So, with a quick fake-out, he ducked behind the corner of a building, hoping someone would save him. The Minotaur was confused. He started checking the bushes along the fence, but didn't find anyone. Even angrier now, he smashed through the mayor's wall with everything he had. Behind it was the crown prince's bedroom, and the creature remembered this guy had tried to buy him too. Raphael could see it in the beast's eyes. Pure agony, the kind that drives you mad. The Minotaur remembered last night perfectly, and the way the prince laughed while betting just broke his heart. So, to escape this trading city, the creature decided to wipe out every poacher. After tearing down the whole wall, the bull tried to squeeze inside and grab the prince. But Damien snapped out of it just in time and blocked the clawed hand with his sword. The merc covered his boss again and told him to jump out into the yard while he kept the monster busy. The creature unleashed a burst of energy, making the whole building shake. Raphael definitely wasn't ready to die again, so while Damien fought the monster, he took off running. But the Minotaur blocked the way, and only a quick kick from the merc saved the prince's life. After that, the bull started hurling chunks of the wall, dead set on destroying everyone. Damien pulled himself together and demanded a fat bonus if they made it out alive. The absurdity hit Raphael. His bodyguard could have just bailed if it weren't for the money. For a second, the bull lost focus, and then his eyes turned blood red. The rest of the wall crumbled away, opening up a path to jump and escape. Damien started swinging his sword at the monster, pulling its attention away from the prince. But the prince chickened out. If he jumped from the second floor, he'd definitely break his back. Down below, the mayor's shouts rang out as he ordered the guards to clear the debris from the entrance. The mercenary tried to encourage his lord, promising he'd be safe since the healers had already arrived downstairs. There was no time to waste. Damien slashed at the Minotaur's paws, forcing it to back off. And when the beast was fully focused on the swordsman, Raphael made a run for the edge. The prince was about to burst into tears from sheer terror, when suddenly the bull's paw blocked his way to freedom. In his panic, he ended up grabbing the Minotaur's arm himself, trapping himself even more. To his own surprise, the prince scanned the creature's body, and the system showed him the bull's illness. Its energy flow was all messed up, putting serious strain on its heart. Most likely, it happened because of an overdose of sleeping pills and crappy food in the dungeon. Raphael was sure the Minotaur's heart hurt like hell every time it struck. That insane pain was clouding the creature's mind, making it impossible to calm down. Right now, the prince couldn't heal the beast. After all, it was trying to kill him. The moment he looked down, fear nearly knocked him out. One wrong move and he'd crash onto the rocks. The Minotaur got tired of shaking its arms, so it decided to just squash the annoying kid. Panicking, Damien tried to attack the beast, but rushed it, and his sword got stuck in its horn. Berserker magic surged through the mercenary's sword, making it heavier and messing up his aim. Raphael clung to the creature's fur for dear life, giving his bodyguard a chance to save him. Damien just needed to land any kind of hit on the enemy. Anything to give himself a shot. A flurry of sword strikes blinded the beast, but the bull kept stubbornly blocking the way down. The prince's strength gave out. He lost his grip on the Minotaur's fur and started falling, straight to his death. The guy had pretty much accepted he was done for, until he suddenly landed in someone's strong arms. Raphael had never been so happy to see Anise show up at the perfect moment, and she was definitely getting a bonus for saving him. First, though, he had to make it to the hideout and wait out the Minotaur attack. Out in the yard, Simon showed up and pointed the boss toward the docks while the other mercs kept the monster busy. The street echoed with a terrifying roar. The beast had just lost its target. Damien felt calm now that the boss was safe. He was ready to tear the enemy apart. Those brutal attacks and that close call with death? Yeah, they fired up the merc's urge to double his bonus. It was like the Minotaur's fists were made of steel. His sword just couldn't hurt him. Guess the merc was getting rusty since he quit being a gladiator, and now the monster was about to crush him. The beast pinned its opponent against the far wall, leaving almost no room to fight back. With one sharp blow, the Minotaur sent Damien flying into the wall. For a second, the guy blacked out. A squad of guards finally reached the mansion, but a rain of debris from the wall sent them scattering. While the beast was distracted by the guards, Damien managed to come to his senses. But the regular soldiers weren't much help, and the merc didn't have time to hide, because the Minotaur trapped him again. But before the monster could crush him, a spiky ball, like a giant hedgehog, dropped from the sky. Damien had busted his ass to save the prince, but the guy ignored his orders and came back anyway. Turns out he'd tossed his hedgehog. Yeah, the one the size of a horse, right through the hole in the wall. The magic seeds worked, and Raphael told his partner to hurry up, or the hedgehog would shrink down to a tiny ball soon. The mercenary was grateful, already dreaming about the fat reward he'd get for this job. The little hedgehog tried to hold off the enemy, jabbing him with his quills, but there was no way he could win. Reinforcements were losing, and Raphael ordered the merc to grab the hedgehog so they could get down. The next second, the Minotaur tossed the little guy aside, and by pure luck, Damien managed to grab onto the quills. That huge plush belly shot up in the air, and the rest of the room finally collapsed. All the guards scattered from the wreckage, but the partners kept watching the end of the fight. In the darkness, the Minotaur's roar echoed, then faded into silence as the building came crashing down. This was their first win as a team, and Raphael promised the hedgehog a nice bonus for his help. The prince figured Pierrot definitely didn't need to know about all the dangers in Cremo. Otherwise, the healer might just have a heart attack. But he was still worried about Damien's injuries. Even though the guy used to be a gladiator, now he was a friend. Still, the boss was pissed the Minotaur might have died in the rubble. If that happened, all his plans for the clinic would go up in smoke. Out in the manor's yard, the city mayor showed up, panicking as he checked on the air and ordered him to follow him to the shelter. Down at the port, a ship was ready to take the prince across to the other side. 100 bodyguards cleared the way to the docks, but the city was still holding it together. The mayor told the prince to head back to the capital by sea. Right now, that was the safest bet. Running from danger sounded smart, but for some reason, Raphael felt guilty about it. And when the mayor of Cremo refused to board with the crew, the prince realized the guy was actually a coward. Cremo was supposed to be a brave man, but with a monster tearing up the city, he chose to save his people. For years, the Cremo family had looked after the empire's trading capital, and now the last heir had to save that legacy. The safety of so many families rests on the mayor's shoulders, and he's ready to pay for the attack with his own blood. Raphael was blown away by the Duke's guts. The guy handed over his personal ship and stayed behind to face danger alone. From day one, the prince thought of Cremo as a selfish guy obsessed with his own success. Time was running out, so Damien demanded the boss get on board and head home. Everyone had their part to play. The mayor had to protect the city, and the prince was meant to lead the empire someday. As for his mercenaries, the hedgehog and Damien, their job was to keep the prince safe. So let's not make it harder for them. Raphael's imperial status would always haunt him, so for the sake of everyone in the empire, he had to look after himself. The ship's captain raised the anchor while the mayor was assigning soldiers at the port. But the mass escape failed because a Minotaur came barreling down the main street, smashing everything in its path. With nothing in its way, the beast made it to the port and landed on the ship's deck with a single massive leap. There's no way Raphael's making it out of this province alive. He's definitely going to drown at sea. The monster snapped the mast and started swinging it around, knocking sailors overboard. Bad news for the prince. He couldn't swim, and his whole health system was going haywire from the stress. Damien found the boss behind the broken mast and told him to hide while he went to earn himself another bonus. Then the guy drew his sword and attacked the monster from behind. Anise transformed into a werewolf and teamed up with Damien to take on the Minotaur. But it didn't even flinch from their attacks, and with a sudden swing, it knocked the wolf girl to the floor. The surviving mercenaries banded together and pushed the beast toward the edge of the deck. But when it got cornered, the Minotaur started tossing enemies overboard. Damien was already hurt from the first fight, and after this second round, he couldn't even stand up. Raphael peeked out from cover, checking out the monster and seeing who was still alive. Because of the whole near-death stress thing, the Rahancore went into overdrive, so the guy started predicting the Minotaur's moves. The hologram tagged the enemy on its own, letting the prince get a read on the bull's health. But after that first wave of defense, it looked like the beast wasn't in a hurry to keep fighting. The ship was barely staying afloat, and there was no one left who could actually fight back. The whole mercenary squad was wiped out, and even Annis couldn't help the prince now. Right next to Raphael, a hedgehog, who'd turned giant to shield his master, collapsed. It was time to forget about being the heir and just save his friends while he still had some energy left. The Minotaur was about to smash the ship to splinters, but suddenly Raphael ate some growth seeds and shot up to the same size as his enemy. After a night like that, half the townsfolk would need something to calm their nerves. After all, they just saw their prince turn into a giant. The surviving sailors freaked out since the ship couldn't handle all that weight and started sinking. The raging Minotaur went wild, beating on his enemy while the prince's health bar glitched out from the strain. Raphael managed to block the beast's claws, but he only had a couple minutes left to win. If he couldn't heal the bull in time, a lot of his friends would die because of him. Neither Raphael nor Chansok had any fighting skills, so they both took a punch right to the jaw. But that didn't knock the guy down, it just pissed him off even more. With his body tougher from the seeds, he went for it and headbutted the enemy straight on. The ship tilted dangerously as the two giants clashed. They needed to snap the Minotaur out of berserk mode, and the hedgehog's giant quills could do the trick. The pet managed to spit out some brutal quills, but Raphael still had no clue where to stick them. The monster stomped its hooves into the deck and charged, trying to knock its opponent overboard. Raphael jumped over the enemy's back and grabbed its neck, searching for a nerve point. The prince shouted to wake Damien up and ordered him to drive in the needles wherever he placed them. A powerful strike, and lightning split the sky as the needle hit the berserker's nerve. To beat the monster, you first have to calm its heartbeat, which means you gotta keep hitting that neck nerve with needles. Lightning flashed overhead while the soldiers were coming to their senses, and the Minotaur didn't attack them. The berserker's energy started to fade, and the monster's aura lost its rage. But Raphael was pissed at the bull since it kept dodging the needles, and there wasn't much time left to heal him. Changing his grip on the neck, the guy managed to pin the needle in place, finally finishing the procedure. The Minotaur's eyes cleared up and its heartbeat steadied, even though its pulse was still racing. The prince nailed it, so he happily patted the beast on the shoulder. Sure, the air didn't speak any magic languages, but it seemed like the Minotaur was grateful. Suddenly, his body systems glitched, and the guy lost his balance. His insides felt the blackout coming, but his lungs had already clocked out. The magic growth seed wore off, and Raphael went back to normal. All his helpers crowded around their lord, who honestly looked like he was about to breathe his last. The tense night was over, but the prince, barely conscious, announced his body would be in a coma for a week. The sailors started bailing water out of the ship, trying to stop it from sinking. The main problem? The Minotaur was so heavy the whole ship was tilting toward the water. Everyone on deck started grabbing onto anything they could so they wouldn't fall overboard. And out of nowhere, the monster grabbed the prince and jumped into the sea, heading for the other shore. The bodyguards didn't even have time to react. The monster vanished into the waves with their lord. The next day, an imperial investigator showed up in Cremo and arrested Damien. The inspector was ordered to find the crown prince, and he was sure the ex-mercenary had something to do with the disappearance. But after hours of interrogation, he still hadn't gotten a confession. So the investigator decided to threaten Damien with execution if the emperor's heir wasn't found. As soon as a messenger brought the shocking news to the capital, Emperor Taros lost it. He had no idea his son had left. Because of that, the search party covered the distance to the port city in just one day. But after 2 days of searching, the prince's bodyguards and the mayor's guards hadn't made any progress. Now the investigator was convinced this was all a setup against the royal family. Damien accused the inspector of personally getting in the way of finding the prince. The mercenary believed they were making progress, and that with all the bodyguards arrested, the prince might already be dead. But the inspector hinted he needed to get back to the capital fast, and there was nothing he could do if the prince died. On top of that, the guy was sure he'd get a promotion if the traitor ended up dead. According to the investigator's plan, he wanted to drag the mayor of Cremo down with him, fired and executed. That way, if he could quietly close the case, he wouldn't have to answer to the emperor. Damien realized the real conspiracy was brewing right at the emperor's throne, and maybe Theodore was involved. The mercenary tried to break free from the chains tying him to the chair. Guards showed up in the dungeon right away and on the inspector's orders grabbed the prisoner. Late that night, with no witnesses around, the guards locked Damien up in a cage. When the guy came to, he saw all his buddies locked up in cages too, hanging above the ground. Down below, soldiers were running around, setting up a giant bonfire and getting ready for an execution. The imperial investigator showed up in the square, ready to carry out the punishment. Damien, furious, started pounding on the bars because he still believed the prince was alive. The guards lit their torches, splashed oil on the fire, and on the inspector's orders, surrounded the prisoners. But then, in the quiet of the night, that familiar roar echoed again, and the moon was blocked by a massive monster's silhouette. Huge llamas snapped the chains, grabbed Damien's cage, and the beast dashed away from the flames. Everyone was stunned to see Raphael, perfectly fine, sitting right on the Minotaur's shoulder. The guards had no clue what to do. Their commander had convinced them the heir was beyond saving. Raphael made it just in time, but he had no idea why his friends were locked up and demanded the inspector explain everything. A couple days earlier, the prince had woken up in a stone cave surrounded by seaweed and sand. Turns out, the Minotaur had brought him back to its lair and taken care of him for a few days. When his new friend woke up, the creature did its best to explain what happened, feeling guilty about the rampage. But the prince knew he'd only healed the beast's heart for a while, and the process would have to be repeated. Suddenly, it hit Raphael. The Minotaur was his for free, and after saving it, the creature would be his loyal servant. On that remote shore, there was peace and quiet, but the heir knew he had to head home. And before setting out, he decided to heal the bull again, now with fresh strength. The system showed energy flowing through the heart, but for some reason, it was moving slowly. Raphael told the creature it had some kind of foreign object stuck in its chest, and he also noticed the beast had stomach problems, probably from the crappy conditions in prison. At the prince's request, the beast went into meditation, opening up its energy chakras. Then Raphael told the Minotaur to hit its own chest as hard as it could, hoping to shake loose the foreign object. And lucky for everyone, the creature coughed up a massive chunk of bile, which the prince planned to use for a magic pill. The beast really did start breathing easier, and it actually seemed happy to join its new friend. But now they had to hurry. Damien and the other mercenaries were probably in deep trouble after the kidnapping. Still, the Minotaur started resisting and didn't want to leave its hideout. So Raphael promised his new pet that nobody in the city would hurt him, and that they could set out together. All the way until evening, the Minotaur fought through raging waves, protecting his new friend. And when they finally reached the port, there was no chaos, just the Emperor's flag flying over the watchtowers. The prince showed up just in time because some crazy inspector was about to burn all his friends alive. To get some answers, the guy asked the Minotaur to growl menacingly at all the soldiers. The inspector stepped out from the crowd and casually announced that he was the hand of the law, and the ruler had given him permission to use any methods. But that arrogant tone just pissed off the prince. Even the investigation hadn't been done. Still, the investigator ordered the prince to be seized, calling him a magical fake. Raphael was stunned by his father's assistant's stupidity, and if he couldn't convince him, Taros would be down one son. The heir got angry and ordered the cages lowered. His friends had already been through enough. Raphael said in front of everyone that his bodyguard Damien had risked his life in every attack to protect the prince. The mercenary couldn't believe his lord was standing up for his honor, making him out to be a hero. The prince could have brushed off their friendship as just a warrior wanting to earn some cash, but that hadn't been true for a long time. The Minotaur tore through the iron bars of the cage, setting the bodyguard free. Raphael also announced that Anis, the leader of the werewolf clan, is actually his guardian too. She risked her life, made it through the rockslide, and saved him from falling to his death, twice. On his friend's command, the Minotaur ripped the cage off its chains and set the girl free. The prince thanked his nurse for her courage and sacrifice, promising her a hefty bonus. All the mercenaries in the cages sided with the prince, saying their lord had come back a true hero. The Minotaur kept opening cages, freeing the heir's comrades from their chains. Raphael said he's got dozens of witnesses. Even his own father knows some of them. The investigator started to panic. This was supposed to be simple, and now he's facing execution for betrayal and messing up the search. But the guy was sure the sick lord had died long ago, so he rounded up everyone tied to the riots. That's how it always goes. Whenever someone from the imperial family dies, their squad just starts executing everyone. The inspector dropped to his knees before the lord, knowing he'd have to own up to his mistake. But Raphael didn't care about him. The mayor of Cremo was still locked up, and that guy was a real hero. The man broke down in tears after hearing such praise. After all, the prince himself had recognized his bravery. The heir promised to help rebuild the city with imperial funds, saying the port deserved a great leader. Still, Raphael was pissed at the special squad. They had no clue what it cost to defend the city. And for the people who protected him, for everyone who suffered even a little, he came back to set things right. Just like a real prince should. The young lord didn't want to hear any excuses. As far as he was concerned, hiding a dynasty member's death was the right call for an ordinary citizen. The inspector started begging the heir not to kill him, saying he was ready to take whatever punishment he deserved. By morning, the city guards were clearing the rubble and searching for the wounded. By then, everyone knew the imperial investigator had been arrested and was waiting for trial in the capital. But what really blew the workers' minds was hearing that the crown prince himself had tamed a raging minotaur. The mayor's assistant overheard some gossip where people were saying the prince had insane strength. One old guy even suggested making Raphael the mayor just to avoid disasters like this in the future. But then, out of nowhere, someone dropped the news that the prince was already crowned, and now that's all anyone in the capital's talking about. Damien was watching everyone work from his bedroom window, but it looked like they'd have rehearsal problems waiting for them when they got home. Not that the prince seemed to care. He finally got a good night's sleep for once. Still, all of the Lord's bodyguards were dying to know how he managed to tame the beast. Truth is, there was no training at all, but that's a secret just between the guy and the Minotaur. Raphael just vaguely said that back when he was huge, he used needles to fix the creature's heart. And now, for everyone's benefit, the Minotaur honestly believes he's serving the guy who saved his life. Since nobody's planning to kill the heir, Damien went ahead and asked for a bonus for risking his neck. Meanwhile, the prince started talking about his other pets, who actually help him save lives just for a meal. Damien figured he'd better step up his game. After all, the prince really could have died out there. He also bragged that he'd collected samples of every medicinal herb in the mansion's basement overnight. But the biggest news was that after the Lord disappeared, the Emperor himself headed to Cremo, but now he's back home. Raphael was feeling proud of himself. Sure, his dad might act cold, but he's still worried about his son's life. With his father gone, launching the magic pill was finally possible, so the prince gave the order to start production. After all, he's got the Minotaur's golden resource, enough to make him rich in a single night. On his orders, the mansion's kitchen was rebuilt first, and the pill ingredients were rushed in from the market. If they get the dosage right, just one chunk of Minotaur bile could make 1,000 pills. Honestly, Damien was blown away by the master's imagination. He was actually creating a one-of-a-kind ingredient. After a few hours and a bunch of tries, the first test batch was finally ready. Without hesitating, the guy popped the pill and his insides just lit up, feeling a rush of energy. The Minotaur was chilling out in the yard, totally relaxed, while the cleaners bustled around him. So when the prince showed up with some good news, the beast just complained about a little chest pain. After trying the life pill himself, the prince was sure it would work great. He handed the animal a few pills and told him to eat them all to get rid of the pain. The life support system was blowing up with notifications about a breakthrough medicine and the doctor's skills leveling up big time. And after the first pill, Raphael's organs felt more alive than ever, begging for another dose. It was a lucky day, so the prince decided to kick back with his new pet under the sun. That evening, a stage went up in the market square, and a huge crowd of rich folks gathered. The prince made a dramatic entrance, riding in on the Minotaur, grabbing everyone's attention. Now it was time to pull out all his sales skills. Otherwise, he'd have no clients left when he got back to the capital. You could tell the whole crowd was scared of the giant beast. But with the prince there, nobody dared leave. The organizers took it seriously and gave the master a magic loudspeaker. After his fight with his younger brother, Raphael hadn't really stood out, so he was feeling nervous. Sometimes Damien felt like he was working for a local hustler obsessed with money, not a future emperor. Wasting no time, the prince pulled out a pack with a golden pill, announcing it could cure any disease. Mayor Cremo personally set up the presentation and cheered the guy on from the crowd with everything he had. Earlier that day, Raphael had told him about the new product and suggested teaming up to promote it. After the failed attempt on the prince's life, the mayor was freaking out, thinking his career was over. But since the heir decided to give him a shot, he's ready to pull every string he's got. If only Chansok met the mayor back in Korea, his clinic would have never shut down. But since he's in a whole different world now, he'll just become a pharma tycoon and make Cremo an even richer city. The mayor kept his word, gathered the crowd, and the prince thanked him for his work. But it seemed like neither Damien nor Annis were impressed with the trade deal, though the clinic still needed the cash. The wild description of the pill's healing powers blew all the nobles' minds. And to hype them up even more, Raphael promised everyone who bought the pill would get the strength of a minotaur. The nobles hung on his every word like they were hypnotized, already picturing their insomnia gone and their manhood boosted. The prince announced sales were open, but warned that the batch was super limited. His assistants rolled out posters hyping up the pill's effects and offering a discount for first-time buyers. A split second of confusion turned into a roar of cheers from the crowd, all demanding to buy everything. Raphael felt like, with buyers this gullible, he could be the king of marketing. The prince's assistants came down to the crowd and started lining up everyone who wanted to buy. To clear up any doubts, the boss said he personally helped develop the pill. That got the crowd even more pumped when they heard about the new clinic in the capital. So, giving a signal to his team, Raphael promised everyone a free doctor's appointment. Meanwhile, his nurse was handing out coupons for cutting-edge medicine to anyone interested. The prince also promised that the hospital's doors would always be open for any patient's family. And as the future heir of the empire, he declared his main mission was to raise a healthy generation of citizens. Some of the workers in the crowd started shouting, those who'd already been to the clinic and whose families were all healthy now. Anise and Damien were dead sure that with a boss like this, they'd end up handing out flyers in every city on the way home. But impressing the nobles wasn't enough. Raphael wanted to find sick people right now. So the guy started convincing everyone that Cremo would only thrive if calm, healthy citizens were in charge. His words actually brought tears to the local merchants' eyes. Everyone wanted to make money and live a little longer. And before he finished his speech, the heir announced he'd personally check anyone who wanted at the city infirmary. Anise was freaking out. There was no way she could handle that many patients alone. But the promo kept rolling when the prince said spots were limited and people needed to line up right now. He was like the devil himself, firing up the crowd, and they went wild for his magic pill. But the real kicker? Today, he could score a few extra lives for himself. All evening, the boss checked on elderly ladies, telling each one to take care of her heart. Then he handed out free coupons for extra doctor visits, even promising to cover their travel to the clinic. In the end, all the coupons were gone, but Anise couldn't figure out why the prince was so happy. She wasn't even sure they had enough money to keep those public promises. But if the boss was happy, she figured she shouldn't argue, especially since he was paying her. If Treasurer Martin had been there, the guy probably would have had a heart attack from all the prince's excitement. Anyway, the event went off without a hitch, though Damien had no clue how his buddy was still standing. As soon as the prince got up to say goodbye to the guests, the system started sending notifications. His organs were screaming from the overload, like his body had caught some kind of workaholic fever. And in the very next moment, the guy lost his balance and passed out right in front of the nobles. But not wanting to look weak, he pulled himself together and told everyone it was time to head home. A little pity wouldn't hurt his image, and he hoped the crowd would appreciate his sacrifice. And as soon as his likability went up, the system let him know that the prince could now earn health points from a better reputation. But reputation points could also be spent on lie coupons, which honestly made the guy ridiculously happy. Damien helped his buddy to his feet, shooing the gawkers away. The mercenary kept the prince steady and joked that if he paid enough, he'd even carry him around. Mayor Cremo got so attached to the young lord that he saw him off with tears in his eyes. After that recent fainting spell, the man was worried the prince would show up in the capital as just a corpse. But the carriage was already set up with comfy coffins instead of beds, so the trip promised to be an easy one. The mayor was glad they'd met. There were a lot of rumors about the emperor's eldest son, but he turned out to be a great guy. With the crowd applauding, the prince climbed into his carriage, promising to cure Mr. Cremo too. After all, just like Father Roberto's assistant, the guy was clearly going bald way too early, even though he deserved a full head of curls. A week later, the heir's carriage rolled into Magentano's capital at dawn. But even that couldn't save the citizens from the sight of a giant minotaur looming over the city. In the small palace courtyard, guards were bustling around, but among them was a messenger from the imperial palace. The man woke the prince up with loud shouts, saying he had an urgent message. As the emperor's trusted agent, he delivered an envelope from Roberto's assistant. But as soon as Raphael saw the black mourning envelope, he was speechless. Apparently, he was an orphan in this life too.